Case 1. Krista Pike. She was just 18 years old when she committed a murder so brutal that it would make her the youngest woman sentenced to death in modern America. But behind the violence was a teenager whose life had been marked by chaos, abuse, and untreated mental illness from the very beginning. Krista Gale Pike was born in March 1976 in Beckley, West Virginia. Her childhood was defined by instability. Her parents' relationship was volatile, marked by infidelity, divorce, remarriage, and ongoing neglect. As an infant, Krista was found crawling through piles of dog feces in the family home, while her mother continued a lifestyle of partying and carousing. She experienced severe seizures as a toddler, but her parents' chaotic lives meant medical care was inconsistent at best. An aunt who witnessed the conditions later described the profound neglect that shaped Krista's earliest years. Though she had been intelligent as a young child, the constant upheaval destroyed any chance at stability. Krista changed schools frequently, and her academic performance suffered. By 10th grade, she was sent to a juvenile facility for a year. It was there that she became interested in the Job Corps, a government program designed to help at-risk youth gain vocational training and career skills. After completing her GED, Krista set her sights on becoming a nursing assistant. In late 1994, at just 18 years old, she enrolled at the Job Corps Center in Knoxville, Tennessee, hoping for a fresh start. But the patterns of her troubled childhood followed her. At the Job Corps Center, Krista began dating Tatterell Shipp, a boy a year younger than her. Together, they developed an interest in the occult and devil worship. The relationship was intense and possessive. When Krista became convinced that a fellow student, 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer, was trying to steal Tatterell from her, jealousy consumed her. Friends of Colleen denied the accusations entirely, but Krista's paranoia only deepened. On the night of January 12, 1995, Krista lured Colleen to a secluded wooded area on the University of Tennessee campus grounds under false pretenses. What Colleen believed would be a conversation turned into something unimaginable. Krista and Tatterell attacked her with a box cutter and a chunk of asphalt. The assault lasted approximately 30 minutes. Krista carved a pentagram into Colleen's chest. When it was over, she took a piece of Colleen's skull as a trophy. A groundskeeper discovered Colleen's body the next day. He later testified that it was so badly beaten, he initially mistook it for the corpse of an animal. The brutality of the crime shocked investigators and the Knoxville community. Within days, police had arrested Krista Pike, Tatterell Shipp, and a third student, Shadala Peterson, who had helped plan the attack but was not present during the murder itself. Krista was just 18 years old. Tatterell was 17. The difference in their ages would prove significant in the legal proceedings that followed. Prosecutors moved quickly. Krista, Tatterell, and Shadala were all charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Shadala agreed to testify for the prosecution and received probation in exchange for pleading guilty to being an accessory after the fact. The state sought the death penalty for Krista and life without parole for Tatterell. During the trial, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Krista had confessed to the crime. She had kept the piece of Colleen's skull and shown it to other students. The forensic evidence was damning. In March 1996, after just 2 hours of deliberation, a jury found Krista Pike guilty of first-degree murder. She was 20 years old when the death sentence was handed down on March 30, 1996. She became the youngest woman sentenced to death in the United States in the modern era of capital punishment. Tatterell Shipp, because he was only 17 at the time of the murder, was not eligible for the death penalty under existing law. He received a life sentence with the possibility of parole. His parole eligibility date is set for December 2026. The disparity in their sentences would become a central issue in Krista's appeals. Just a few months separated their ages at the time of the crime. Both participated in the attack. Yet one faced execution, while the other would eventually have a chance at freedom. How could someone so young be considered fully culpable for such violence? Over the years, more details about Krista's background emerged. She had been born with a malformation of the brain and suffered from organic brain damage. She was later diagnosed with bipolar disorder and severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Her childhood had been marked not just by neglect, but by sexual violence and abuse that her state-appointed trial lawyers never presented to the jury. The jurors who sentenced her to death never heard the full scope of the trauma that had shaped her development. In 2001, while already on death row, Krista attacked another inmate, Patricia Jones, strangling her with a shoestring and nearly killing her. She was convicted of attempted first-degree murder and received an additional 25-year sentence. The incident seemed to confirm the prosecution's characterization of her as irredeemably violent. But advocates argued it also demonstrated the effects of nearly 3 decades in solitary confinement on someone with severe mental illness. For almost 30 years, Krista Pike has been held in conditions that her attorneys describe as the equivalent of solitary confinement. As the only woman on Tennessee's death row, she was kept isolated in a space the size of a parking spot, spending 22 to 24 hours per day in a 7 by 12-foot cell. In September 2024, after litigation over the constitutionality of her confinement, Tennessee reached a settlement that allowed Krista access to a job, shared meals with other incarcerated women, and more time out of her cell. The change came after nearly 3 decades of isolation. On September 30th, 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court set an execution date for Krista Pike. If her execution proceeds as scheduled on September 30th, 2026, she will become the first woman executed in Tennessee in more than 200 years. She will also be the only person executed in Tennessee for a crime committed at age 18, 19, or 20 in the modern death penalty era. The case has drawn support from an unlikely coalition. Advocacy groups point to advances in neuroscience showing that the human brain continues developing well into the 20s, particularly in areas governing impulse control and decision-making. A federal appellate judge wrote that executing someone for a crime committed at 18 likely violates evolving standards of decency, noting that had Krista been just a few months younger, like Tatterall, she would not be eligible for execution at all. More than 2,500 people have signed a petition asking Tennessee Governor Bill Lee to commute her sentence to life imprisonment. Supporters argue that life imprisonment is the appropriate punishment for Krista, just as it has been for nearly 200 women convicted of first-degree murder in Tennessee since 1978 who did not receive death sentences. They point to the disparity between her sentence and Tatterall Shipp's. Krista was in an abusive relationship with Tatterall at the time of the crime, they argue, and he was a leader in the offense. Executing her while he becomes eligible for parole strikes many as fundamentally unjust. Yet the question remains inescapable. How could someone so young commit such unfathomable violence? What drives an 18-year-old to carve symbols into another person's body and keep a piece of their skull as a souvenir? Can untreated mental illness and childhood trauma explain, if not excuse, such brutality? Colleen Slemmer was 19 years old when she died. She had traveled to Knoxville seeking the same opportunity Krista had, a chance to build a better future through Job Corps training. Her family has lived with her loss for 3 decades. No amount of debate about brain development or sentencing disparity can restore what was taken from them. Krista Pike remains on death row in Tennessee. If the execution date stands, she will be put to death at age 50 for a crime she committed at 18. The case forces an uncomfortable question that has no easy answer. At what point does youth end and full accountability begin? And when severe mental illness intersects with that youth, how do we measure responsibility? Tennessee has not executed a woman since before the state began keeping formal records. Whether that history continues or ends may depend on how society answers those questions about Krista Gale Pike. Case 2. Lisa Montgomery. The crime was so disturbing that it seemed to defy comprehension. A pregnant woman strangled in her own home, her baby cut from her womb with a kitchen knife. The infant survived, but the mother did not. What investigators discovered was a crime driven not by rage or greed, but by delusion born from a lifetime of unimaginable trauma. Lisa Montgomery was 36 years old when she committed one of the most shocking crimes in federal history. But to understand what happened on December 16, 2004, it is necessary to understand what had been done to Lisa Montgomery long before that day. Lisa was born in 1968, and her childhood was defined by horror. Her mother, Judy Shaughnessy, subjected her to severe physical and sexual abuse starting when Lisa was very young. But the abuse went far beyond what typically occurs even in the worst homes. Judy trafficked her own daughter, allowing men to rape Lisa in exchange for money or services. One man who did work on the family's property was given access to Lisa as payment. The abuse was not hidden or denied by those who witnessed it. Multiple people later confirmed what Lisa had endured, including gang rapes orchestrated by her own mother. The trauma caused severe and lasting damage. Medical experts who later examined Lisa found she suffered from brain damage consistent with repeated head trauma, likely from being beaten and throttled over many years. The abuse destroyed her ability to process reality normally. She developed severe mental illness, including dissociation, psychosis, and complex PTSD. By adulthood, Lisa's grip on reality was tenuous at best. In the years before the crime, Lisa's mental state deteriorated further. She became fixated on the idea of being pregnant, even when she was not. She told elaborate lies about pregnancies that did not exist. Her behavior grew increasingly erratic and delusional. Multiple people noticed her strange claims and deteriorating mental condition, but no intervention occurred that might have prevented what was coming. In late 2004, Lisa began participating in online communities for dog breeders and rat terrier enthusiasts. It was there that she encountered Bobby Jo Stinnett, a 23-year-old woman from Skidmore, Missouri. Bobby Jo bred dogs and was 8 months pregnant with her first child. She and her husband were preparing for the baby's arrival, excited about becoming parents. Lisa, operating under a false identity online, contacted Bobby Jo with interest in purchasing a puppy. They arranged for Lisa to visit Bobby Jo's home on December 16, 2004. That morning, Lisa drove from her home in Kansas across the state line into Missouri. She brought with her a rope and a knife. When Bobby Jo let Lisa into her home, Lisa attacked her. She strangled Bobby Jo with the rope until she lost consciousness. Then, using the kitchen knife, Lisa performed a crude cesarean section, cutting the baby from Bobby Jo's womb. The baby girl survived. Lisa wrapped the infant in blankets, left Bobby Jo's body in the house, and drove back to Kansas. She immediately began trying to pass the baby off as her own newborn. Bobby Jo's mother discovered her daughter's body that afternoon when she arrived at the house and found Bobby Jo on the floor in a pool of blood. She called emergency services, but it was too late. Bobby Jo Stinnett was pronounced dead. Investigators immediately recognized the horrifying nature of what had occurred. The FBI became involved because the crime crossed state lines, making it a federal case. Using computer records and online communications, Investigators quickly identified Lisa Montgomery as a suspect. They traced the emails and online messages between Lisa and Bobby Joe. Within 24 hours of the murder, law enforcement arrived at Lisa's home in Kansas and found her with the baby. She initially claimed the child was hers, that she had just given birth. Medical examination quickly proved otherwise. Lisa Montgomery was arrested and charged with kidnapping, resulting in death, a federal capital offense. The evidence against her was overwhelming. She had communicated with Bobby Joe under a false name. She had driven to Missouri with weapons. She had strangled the victim and taken the baby. There was no question about what had happened. But the question of why and whether Lisa was even capable of understanding her actions would become the central issue in her case. During the trial in federal court in Kansas City, Missouri, prosecutors presented the facts of the crime in stark detail. They argued that Lisa had planned the attack, researched how to perform a cesarean section, and carried it out with deliberation. The jury heard testimony about the communications between Lisa and Bobby Joe, the drive from Kansas to Missouri, and the brutality of the attack. On October 26, 2007, the jury convicted Lisa Montgomery and recommended a death sentence. She was formally sentenced to death on April 4, 2008, becoming only the third woman on federal death row. What the jury did not hear in full detail was the scope of Lisa Montgomery's mental illness and the lifetime of abuse that had caused it. Her trial attorneys presented some evidence of her troubled background, but much of the most damaging information about her mother's trafficking and the resulting brain damage was not fully explored. Later appeals would argue that the jury never understood that they were sentencing someone whose mind had been destroyed by trauma inflicted on her as a child. After her conviction, Lisa's attorneys filed extensive appeals based on her mental state. Forensic psychiatrists examined her and found severe mental illness that had been exacerbated by the lifetime of sexual torture she suffered at the hands of family members and others. Medical imaging showed brain damage. Experts testified that Lisa suffered from dissociation so severe that she was often unable to distinguish between reality and delusion. Her fixation on being pregnant, they argued, was a psychotic symptom, not a calculated lie. The appeals raised a fundamental question. Does it violate the Constitution to execute someone who is unable to rationally understand her own execution due to severe mental illness? The Supreme Court had previously ruled in Ford v. Wainwright that executing someone who is insane violates the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Lisa's attorneys argued that her condition met that threshold. For more than a decade, Lisa Montgomery remained on federal death row at the Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, a facility designed for inmates with mental health needs. Her case moved slowly through the appeals process. Then, in 2019, the federal government announced it would resume federal executions after a 17-year hiatus. In 2020, Lisa's execution date was set for December. Her attorneys, still pursuing appeals, contracted COVID-19 while traveling to Texas to work on her case. The execution was briefly postponed. A new date was set for January 12, 2021, just days before the presidential inauguration. President-elect Joe Biden had indicated he opposed the federal death penalty and would likely halt executions, making the timing significant. As the execution date approached, the case drew international attention. Advocacy groups pointed to Lisa's severe mental illness and lifetime of abuse. A former warden who had supervised Lisa in prison urged clemency, noting her exceptional adjustment and the fact that she had become a stabilizing presence who helped other inmates. Hundreds of people wrote letters supporting clemency, including survivors of sexual violence who saw in Lisa's story a system that had failed to protect an abused child, and was now preparing to kill her for actions driven by the mental illness that abuse had caused. On behalf of Pope Francis, Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano wrote to the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles, urging them to spare Lisa's life. The European Union sent appeals. Mental health organizations argued that executing someone with such profound mental illness set a dangerous precedent. The case highlighted the intersection of gender-based violence, childhood trauma, and capital punishment. In the final days, Lisa's attorneys filed emergency appeals arguing she was incompetent to be executed. They presented evidence that Lisa's mental state had deteriorated further and that she did not have a rational understanding of her execution. Federal courts reviewed the claims but ultimately denied the appeals. On January 12, 2021, the Supreme Court issued an order allowing the execution to proceed. Lisa Montgomery was transferred from Texas to the federal execution facility at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. Bobby Joe Stinnett's family traveled there as well to witness the execution. Lisa's attorney, Kelly Henry, released a statement expressing anguish at what was about to occur. She argued that the government had stopped at nothing in its zeal to kill a damaged and delusional woman, and that the Constitution forbids the execution of someone who cannot rationally understand her execution. Shortly after midnight on January 13, 2021, Lisa Montgomery was executed by lethal injection. She was pronounced dead at 1:31 a.m. Eastern Time. She became the first woman executed by the federal government since 1953, a span of nearly 70 years. The execution also broke another barrier. It was the first execution carried out during a presidential transition period in more than 130 years. Lisa's execution drew immediate condemnation from death penalty opponents and mental health advocates. They argued that her case represented everything wrong with capital punishment: the failure to account for severe mental illness, the inability of the justice system to distinguish between culpability and sickness, and the execution of someone whose actions were the direct result of a lifetime of abuse that society had failed to prevent. Bobby Joe Stinnett's family released a statement emphasizing that Bobby Joe was the victim, that she had been targeted and intentionally killed, and that her memory deserved to be honored. They expressed relief that the legal process had concluded, even as they acknowledged that no execution could bring Bobby Joe back or heal the wound left by her loss. The case leaves difficult questions unresolved. Lisa Montgomery committed an act of profound violence, taking a young mother's life and traumatizing everyone who knew and loved Bobby Joe Stinnett. That is an undeniable fact. But it is also undeniable that Lisa Montgomery's mind had been destroyed by abuse inflicted on her when she was a child. Abuse that left her with brain damage and mental illness so severe that multiple experts questioned whether she could be held fully responsible for actions driven by psychosis and delusion. Where does justice lie when both things are true? Can we say that executing someone whose capacity for rational thought was destroyed by trauma represents justice? Or does it simply add another victim to a tragedy that began decades before the crime itself? Lisa Montgomery is gone. Bobby Joe Stinnett is gone. The baby who survived, now a young adult, has grown up knowing the horrific circumstances of her birth. The case remains a stark reminder of the failures that occur when childhood abuse goes unchecked and mental illness goes untreated, and the impossibility of creating justice after such failures have led to irreversible tragedy. Case 3. Darlie Routier. In the early morning hours of June 6, 1996, a frantic 911 call came from a quiet suburban home in Rolette, Texas. A woman screamed that someone had broken into her house and stabbed her children. By the time police arrived, 2 young boys were dying on the living room floor, and their mother had knife wounds to her throat and arm. The question that would consume the next 3 decades was deceptively simple: who wielded the knife? Darlie Lynn Routier was 26 years old, living what appeared to be a comfortable life in an affluent Dallas suburb. She and her husband, Darren, had been married for several years and had 3 sons: Devin, 6 years old, Damon, 5, and Drake, an infant. The family lived in a nice home in a good neighborhood. From the outside, they seemed to have everything, but beneath the surface there were cracks. The Routiers were facing financial difficulties. Darren's business was struggling, and the family's spending had outpaced their income. They were thousands of dollars in debt. Some friends later said they noticed changes in Darlie's behavior in the months before the tragedy, though nothing that suggested she was capable of violence. On the night of June 5, 1996, Darlie and her 2 older sons fell asleep downstairs in the living room. Darren and the baby were upstairs. The family had spent an ordinary evening together. Nothing seemed amiss. At 2:31 a.m., Darlie called 911. The dispatcher heard screaming, "Oh my God, my babies are dying!" Darlie reported that an intruder had come into her home, attacked her and her children, and fled. Police arrived within 3 minutes of the call. They found a scene of horror. Devin and Damon had been stabbed multiple times. Devin was already dead. Damon was still alive, but gravely injured, his small body covered in blood. Darlie had a slash across her throat that came within 2 millimeters of her carotid artery, as well as wounds on her arm. A kitchen knife lay on the counter. There was a cut screen in the garage window. A sock with blood on it was later found in an alley 75 yards from the house. Paramedics rushed Damon to the hospital, but he died shortly after arrival. Devin was pronounced dead at the scene. The Routier home became a crime scene, and investigators began the careful work of piecing together what had happened. Darlie told police that she had been sleeping on the couch when she woke to someone attacking her. She saw a man in dark clothing standing in her living room. He fled through the utility room and garage. She said she followed him part way, then realized her children had been hurt. She claimed she touched the knife on the counter, not realizing at first that it was the murder weapon. Her story was that an intruder had entered through the garage, attacked the family, and escaped. But from the beginning, investigators had doubts. The crime scene did not look like a burglary or a random home invasion. Nothing of significant value had been taken. The cut screen in the garage showed no disturbance in the dust on the windowsill, suggesting no one had actually climbed through. The mulch in the flower beds near the garage was undisturbed, with no footprints or signs that anyone had run through. The garage itself had no blood drops or evidence that someone bleeding from the crime scene had moved through it. Crime scene consultant James Cron examined the evidence and concluded that the scene had been staged. Fibers from the cut screen were found on a bread knife in the kitchen, suggesting the screen had been cut from inside the house. The prosecution would later argue that Darlie had cut the screen herself to support her intruder story. Investigators also focused on Darlie's behavior. On the 911 call, some heard a woman in genuine panic. Others heard someone whose emotions seemed forced or performed. In the days after the murders, Darlie's demeanor struck some people as odd. She did not appear to be grieving in the way they expected a mother who had lost 2 children to grieve. Then came the video that would define the case in the public mind. Devin would have turned 7 years old on June 14, 1996, just 8 days after his death. The family held a birthday party at the gravesite. The celebration included balloons, silly string, and singing. A local television station filmed portions of the event and aired the footage. The video showed Darlie smiling, spraying silly string on the boys' graves, and laughing. The community was shocked. The Dallas County District Attorney, Greg Davis, later said the video sickened him because it showed a full-blown birthday party just a week after the children's deaths. For many people, the silly string video became proof that Darlie Routier was not a grieving mother, but a woman capable of murdering her own children. Darlie was arrested on June 18, 1996, less than 2 weeks after the murders. Police Chief Randall Posey announced that the investigation had concluded the white male suspect Darlie described never existed and that her wounds were self-inflicted. She was charged with capital murder. The case moved quickly. Darlie was indicted, and her trial began in January 1997 in Kerrville, Texas. The trial had been moved from Dallas County due to extensive media coverage that had already convicted Darlie in the court of public opinion. At trial, prosecutors laid out their theory. Darlie Routier, under financial stress and frustrated with her life, had murdered her 2 sons and then staged a home invasion to cover her actions. They presented crime scene evidence showing that the garage contained no blood, that the window screen had been cut from inside, and that the scene appeared staged. They argued that Darlie's wounds were superficial and self-inflicted, designed to make her appear to be a victim. They showed the silly string video to the jury 7 times. Prosecution also presented testimony about the knife. It was a knife from the Routier's own kitchen. Forensic experts testified that the blood evidence and attack patterns were consistent with someone standing over the boys as they slept on the floor, not with a chaotic attack by a stranger. The defense argued that Darlie was also a victim, that her wounds were serious and could have been fatal, and that an intruder had indeed entered the home. They pointed to the bloody sock found 75 yards away, arguing that it proved someone had fled the scene. They emphasized that there was no clear motive for Darlie to kill her children. She had no history of violence or abuse. She had not been diagnosed with postpartum depression or any mental illness. There was no life insurance policy that would have provided financial gain. What possible reason would a mother have to murder her sleeping children? But the defense faced an uphill battle. The crime scene evidence was problematic. The silly string video had poisoned public opinion. After 8 hours of deliberation on February 1, 1997, the jury convicted Darlie Routier of the murder of 5-year-old Damon. 3 days later, they sentenced her to death. She was never tried for Devon's murder, as prosecutors decided one conviction and death sentence was sufficient. Darlie was sent to death row at what was then the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She has been there for more than 27 years, maintaining her innocence every single day. Over the years since her conviction, questions about the case have multiplied. Defense attorneys and innocence advocates have pointed to evidence that was not presented at trial or was not given proper weight. A bloody fingerprint was found on the coffee table in the living room. It does not match anyone in the Routier family or anyone known to have been in the house that night. Another bloody print was found on the utility room door. It also does not match Darlie or any family member. The bloody sock found in the alley contained blood from both boys and from Darlie, as well as an unidentified hair. Defense attorneys argue that the sock proves an intruder fled the scene. How else would a sock with the victim's blood end up 75 yards from the house? Prosecutors suggested Darlie herself planted it, running down the alley while bleeding from her self-inflicted wounds, but no blood trail was found between the house and where the sock was discovered. Then there is the issue of the silly string video. What the jury saw 7 times was a brief clip of Darlie spraying silly string and appearing to celebrate. What the jury did not see was the full video, which showed that before the silly string celebration, the family had held a somber prayer vigil at the graveside. The party atmosphere was part of a deliberate decision to honor what would have been Devon's 7th birthday in a way he would have wanted, not a sign that Darlie felt no grief. One juror, Charles Sanford, later signed an affidavit saying that if the jury had seen the full video showing the prayer service, he would not have voted to convict. DNA testing has advanced significantly since 1996. Defense attorneys have sought additional testing of the fingerprints, the sock, and Darlie's nightshirt, which contained blood evidence. In 2008, Darlie was granted the right to new DNA tests. In 2014, a federal judge ordered further testing on the bloody fingerprint, the sock, and other evidence. As of 2024, some of that testing remains pending, delayed by procedural issues and disputes over methodology. The case has been the subject of multiple books and television documentaries. In 2018, ABC aired a 4-part series called The Last Defense, examining Darlie's case alongside that of Julius Jones. The documentary presented evidence that raised questions about the conviction. Jones's sentence was later commuted. Darlie remains on death row. Support for Darlie's case has come from unexpected sources. Kathy Cruz, a journalist who wrote a book about the case, interviewed Darlie extensively and came away convinced the state got it wrong. A growing number of people who have examined the evidence believe that the crime scene was not staged, that an intruder theory remains viable, and that Darlie Routier is innocent. But multiple appeals courts have reviewed the case and upheld the conviction. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals has rejected challenges based on new evidence. The courts have found that even with the questions about DNA and fingerprints, the totality of the evidence supports the jury's verdict. Darlie's ex-husband, Darren Routier, has never wavered in his belief that Darlie is innocent. He has stated that she is not capable of such violence, that their marriage had problems but nothing that would drive her to murder, and that he believes an intruder killed their sons. The couple divorced years after the conviction, but Darren remains her most steadfast supporter. The questions persist. If Darlie murdered her children, where is the motive? Why would a mother with no history of mental illness, no documented abuse of her children, and no apparent psychotic break suddenly decide to stab her sleeping sons to death? If she staged the scene, how did unidentified fingerprints end up in her home? How did the sock get down the alley with no blood trail? And if she is innocent, how did investigators miss the real killer? How did a jury convict based on circumstantial evidence and a video that may have shown grief expressed in an unconventional way rather than guilt? Devin and Damon Routier would be in their 30s now had they lived. Their lives were taken in the most terrible way imaginable, stabbed as they slept in what should have been the safest place in the world. Their family will never recover from that loss. Whether their mother was the person who killed them, or whether she is. A third victim of that night remains one of the most contested questions in American criminal justice. Darlie Routier sits in her cell in Gatesville, now 55 years old, still insisting she did not kill her children. No execution date has been set. The appeals continue. The debate continues. And the question of what really happened in that suburban home on June 6, 1996, remains unresolved nearly 3 decades later. Case 4, Kelly Gissendoner. On the night her husband was murdered, Kelly Gissendoner was out dancing with friends, laughing and drinking, establishing an alibi while the man she loved carried out the killing she had planned. 18 years later, as corrections officers led her to the execution chamber, she would sing hymns until the drugs stopped her heart. The journey between those two moments tells a story about betrayal, transformation, and whether redemption can ever outweigh murder. Kelly Renee Gissendoner married Douglas Gissendoner in September 1989. Their relationship was turbulent from the start. They separated and divorced in 1993, then reconciled and remarried in May 1995. Kelly had a daughter with Douglas and 2 sons from a previous relationship. Douglas served as stepfather to the boys. In December 1996, the couple bought a house together in Auburn, Georgia, seemingly committed to making their marriage work. But Kelly's commitment was an illusion. By late 1996, she had begun an affair with Gregory Bruce Owen, a man several years younger than her. Kelly and Owen had met casually, and the relationship quickly became intense. She confided in him that her marriage was falling apart, that Douglas was controlling, and their relationship was beyond repair. In November 1996, Kelly first raised the idea of murder. She asked Owen if he knew a way to get rid of Douglas. Owen suggested divorce as the obvious solution. Kelly refused. She told Owen that divorce would not work because Douglas would never leave her alone. He would continue to be part of her life, and she wanted him gone completely. There was also the practical matter of money. If Douglas died, Kelly would inherit the house and receive a payout from his life insurance policy. Divorce would mean splitting assets and losing financial security. Over the next 3 months, Kelly and Owen discussed killing Douglas on 4 or 5 occasions. Each conversation was initiated by Kelly. She was persistent, returning to the subject again and again until Owen agreed. They developed a plan. On February 7, 1997, while Kelly was out with friends establishing an alibi, Owen would kill Douglas. That afternoon, Kelly picked Owen up from his home and drove him to her house. She gave him a nightstick and a 6 to 8 inch hunting knife. She provided detailed instructions about what to do. Then she changed her clothes and left to meet her friends for a night out. Douglas Gissendoner was at a friend's house working on cars that evening. When he returned home around 10 o'clock p.m., Owen was waiting for him. Owen ambushed Douglas, holding him at knife point and forcing him into his own car. Owen drove Douglas to a remote wooded area in Gwinnett County near Harbins Park. He ordered Douglas out of the car and made him kneel on the ground. Owen struck Douglas in the head with the nightstick. Then he stabbed him in the neck and back, 8 to 10 times. The attack was brutal and sustained. Douglas fought for his life, but he was unarmed and overpowered. When it was over, Owen took Douglas's watch and wedding ring to make the murder look like a robbery. Kelly arrived at the scene moments after the killing. She needed to verify that Douglas was dead, that the plan had worked. Satisfied, she and Owen drove away in separate vehicles. They stopped to get kerosene that Kelly had left for Owen, then returned to set Douglas's car on fire about 3/4 of a mile from where his body lay, hidden in the woods. Douglas Gissendoner's body was not discovered until February 20th, 1997, nearly 2 weeks after his death. He was found approximately 1 mile from his burned car, 100 to 150 feet off the road, on his knees, face down. He had received at least 4 stab wounds to the back of the head and neck region. The cause of death was the stab wounds to the neck, though the exact fatal wound could not be determined because animals had devoured much of the soft tissue on the right side of his neck. Initially, Owen denied any involvement. But on February 24, 1997, he confessed and implicated Kelly. The next day, Kelly Gissendoner was arrested for murder. That same day, she called a friend, Pamela Kogut, and said, "I did it." But in the same conversation, she also claimed that Owen had held a knife to her and threatened to kill her and her children if she told anyone about the murder. Both Kelly and Owen were offered the same plea deal before trial: life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Owen accepted the deal and agreed to testify against Kelly. She refused the offer and chose to go to trial. In November 1998, a jury heard the case against Kelly Renee Gissendoner. The prosecution presented Owen's testimony describing how Kelly had initiated the murder plot, provided the weapons, and planned every detail of the killing. They showed that Kelly had established an alibi while the murder occurred. They presented evidence that Kelly had called Douglas's boss hours after the murder to report that her husband would not be coming to work because he was the victim of a homicide. They revealed that Kelly had tried to access Douglas's bank account with a forged check to withdraw $50,000. Investigators testified that Kelly had been trying to gather her dead husband's assets even before he had been buried. The defense argued that Owen was the real killer, that he had manipulated Kelly and that the death penalty was disproportionate, given that Owen himself would not face execution. But the jury was not persuaded. After deliberating, they convicted Kelly Gissendaner on November 18, 1998. The next day, they recommended a death sentence. On November 19, 1998, the sentence was made official. Kelly became the only woman on Georgia's death row. The trial judge, Charles Strauss, called Kelly clearly the head of this serpent. In his view, she was the mastermind who had manipulated Owen into becoming her weapon. The fact that she had not physically wielded the knife did not diminish her culpability. She had planned the murder, initiated every discussion about it, provided the means, and verified the death. In the eyes of the law, she was as guilty as if she had stabbed Douglas herself. The disparity in sentencing became the focal point of Kelly's appeals. Owen, who had actually killed Douglas, received life in prison. Kelly, who had planned it, received death. Critics argued that this was fundamentally unjust. How could the person who did not strike a single blow be sentenced to die, while the person who committed the physical act of murder would eventually have a chance at freedom? The Georgia Supreme Court and subsequent appeals courts rejected this argument. They found that Kelly's role as the architect of the murder made her culpability equal to or greater than Owen's. She had corrupted Owen, convincing him to become a killer. She had used him as a tool to achieve her goal of eliminating her husband while keeping her hands technically clean. But something remarkable happened while Kelly Gissendaner sat on death row. She underwent a profound transformation. Kelly enrolled in a theology program offered through Emory University for inmates. She studied the works of Christian thinkers, particularly Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who had been executed by the Nazis for his opposition to Hitler. Kelly wrote a paper on Bonhoeffer that came to the attention of Jürgen Moltmann, one of the world's most respected theologians. Moltmann was so impressed with her work that he began corresponding with her. They became pen pals, exchanging letters about theology, faith, and redemption. Kelly completed her theological degree. She became a source of stability and support for other women in prison. Correctional officers who worked with her testified to her transformation. She counseled inmates who were suicidal, talking them back from the edge. She became known for her compassion and her ministry work behind bars. Former warden Gwendolyn O'Donnell, who supervised Kelly from 2001 to 2004, later wrote in support of clemency, noting Kelly's exceptional prison adjustment and her role in helping other inmates recognize their worth and find a path forward. In 2015, Kelly's execution was scheduled for February 25th. A winter storm forced a delay until March 2nd. Then, concerns about the execution drugs being improperly stored led to another postponement. The drugs, particularly pentobarbital, were thought to have been spoiled due to colder than recommended storage conditions, though it was later determined the drug had merely precipitated out of solution. As the new execution date approached in September 2015, support for clemency grew. Kelly's children pleaded for their mother's life. Her daughter Kayla told the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles that her father's death had been extremely painful, but that losing her mother to execution would be devastating. She said she could not fathom losing another parent. Norman Fletcher, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Georgia, urged clemency. He argued that capital punishment was not proportional to Kelly's crime, particularly given that Owen had received life. Bob Barr, the Republican Party's general counsel and a former congressman, also supported clemency. Correctional officers who had worked with Kelly added their voices, testifying to her genuine transformation. On behalf of Pope Francis, Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano sent a letter to the board urging them to spare Kelly's life. The letter acknowledged the gravity of her crime and expressed sympathy for the victims, but it argued that life imprisonment would better express both justice and mercy. The appeal from the Vatican was extraordinary, reserved for cases that raise profound moral questions. Georgia is one of only 3 states in which the governor does not have the power to grant clemency. The decision rested entirely with the Board of Pardons and Paroles. On September 29, 2015, the board announced its decision. Clemency was denied. Kelly Gissendaner was scheduled to be executed that same day. Last-minute appeals were filed and denied. By late evening, it was clear the execution would proceed. Kelly was moved to the execution chamber at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson, Georgia. Douglas Gissendaner's family was present as witnesses, as was Kelly's legal team and members of the media. Kelly's final meal had been cheese dip with chips and Texas fajita nachos with a diet frosted lemonade. She had spent her last day meeting with her children, praying, and singing. As Kelly was strapped to the gurney and the execution began, she turned toward the witness room where her supporters could see her. Her final words were brief. "I just want Kathy to know that I love her." Kathy Clifton was Douglas's daughter from his first marriage, Kelly's stepdaughter. Then Kelly began to sing. She sang Amazing Grace, the hymn about redemption and grace for even the worst sinners. Her voice carried through the chamber as the lethal injection drugs entered her bloodstream. She continued singing until the drugs took effect and she lost consciousness. At 12:21 a.m. on September 30th, 2015, Kelly Gissendaner was pronounced dead. She was 47 years old. She became the first woman executed in Georgia in 70 years. The last woman executed in Georgia had been Lena Baker in 1945, an African-American woman later pardoned after it was determined she had likely acted in self-defense. Kelly's execution sparked renewed debate about proportionality in sentencing. She died for a murder she planned but did not commit. Owen, who held the knife and inflicted every wound, remains in prison serving a life sentence but will eventually be eligible for parole. Critics argued that this disparity reflects gender bias, that women who orchestrate violence are judged more harshly than men who commit the same acts. Others pointed to Kelly's transformation as evidence that execution serves no purpose when rehabilitation is possible. She had become, by all accounts, a changed person. She had dedicated herself to helping others, completed a rigorous academic program, and developed a meaningful spiritual life. Was there any purpose served by killing someone who had demonstrated such profound growth? Supporters of the execution, including Douglas's family, emphasized that Kelly had targeted him, planned his death with calculation and patience, and watched as he was murdered. She had tried to profit from his death almost immediately. Her transformation in prison, while admirable, did not erase what she had done. Justice for Douglas, in their view, required that Kelly face the ultimate punishment. Kelly's attorney, Jim Rocap, said after the execution that the machinery of death in Virginia had extinguished a beautiful, childlike, and loving human spirit. He maintained that Kelly's death sentence had been a grave injustice given that Owen would never face execution. Years after the execution, questions about the case persist. Was Kelly truly the mastermind, or had Owen manipulated the situation more than the jury understood? A letter written by Owen to another woman, which came to light after the trial, described Kelly as some ugly bitch who married her husband for the money. And I knew I could get to fall head over heels for me. Owen admitted he had manipulated her from the moment they met, that he had used her to get access to insurance money. But by the time that letter was fully examined, Kelly was already on death row, and appeals courts ruled that it did not change the fundamental facts. She had initiated the murder plot. She had provided the means. She had been present to verify the death. Whatever Owen's motivations or manipulations, Kelly had made her choices. Douglas Gissendaner's daughter, Kathy Clifton, witnessed Kelly's execution. She released a statement saying she had forgiven Kelly, but that the execution brought closure. She said she would finally be able to move on, knowing Kelly could never harm anyone again. Douglas's other family members echoed those sentiments. The case of Kelly Gissendaner leaves no easy answers. Can someone who planned a murder be more culpable than the person who carried it out? Does genuine transformation and redemption earned over nearly 2 decades justify commuting a death sentence? Should gender play any role in these decisions, and if so, how? Douglas Gissendaner lost his life in the most calculated and cold-blooded way imaginable, betrayed by the woman who had promised to love him. That is a truth that cannot be diminished. But Kelly Gissendaner also died. Her execution, carried out even as she sang hymns about grace and redemption, and Gregory Owen remains alive in prison, eligible for parole decades from now. The man who held the knife, but was spared the ultimate punishment. Justice in this case came at the cost of 2 lives instead of 1, and the question of whether that represents true justice or simply compounded tragedy depends entirely on where you stand. Case 5. Teresa Lewis. She had an IQ of 70, placing her in the borderline range of intellectual disability. She was easily manipulated, desperately seeking affection, and unable to understand complex situations. 2 men recognized her vulnerability and used it to orchestrate a double murder, letting her take the fall while they negotiated deals that would spare their lives. When Virginia executed Teresa Lewis in 2010, it raised a question that continues to haunt the case. Can executing someone with such profound intellectual limitations ever be just? Teresa Wilson was born in 1969 in Danville, Virginia. She grew up poor and struggled in school. At 16, she dropped out to marry a man she met in church. The marriage produced 1 daughter, Christy, but ended in divorce. Teresa's life became a pattern of instability, substance abuse, and dependency on others. She moved from job to job, holding nearly 50 low-wage positions by the time she reached her 30s. She struggled with drugs and alcohol, and her relationships were marked by dysfunction. In 2000, Teresa was working at the Dan River Textile Factory in Danville when she met Julian Clifton Lewis. Julian was older than Teresa, a widower who worked as her supervisor. Despite the difference in their backgrounds and the power imbalance in their initial relationship, they married. Julian had a son from a previous relationship, Charles J. Lewis, known as CKJ, who was in his early 20s. Teresa moved into Julian's mobile home in rural Pittsylvania County. For a time, the marriage seemed stable, but Teresa's need for validation and affection, combined with her limited ability to understand when she was being used, made her vulnerable to anyone who showed her attention. In 2002, C.J. Lewis joined the U.S. Army Reserve. As he prepared for potential deployment to Iraq, he took out a life insurance policy for $250,000. He named his father, Julian, as the beneficiary. This was a standard precaution for a young man entering military service. It was also the detail that would cost both C.J. and Julian their lives. Teresa met Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller at a Walmart. The 2 men were roommates living in a nearby mobile home. Schallenberger was 22 years old, charismatic, and calculating. He quickly recognized that Teresa was someone he could manipulate. He began a sexual relationship with her. Teresa, starved for affection and unable to recognize that she was being used, fell deeply in love with him. Schallenberger learned about CJ's life insurance policy. He understood that if Julian died, the money would go to Teresa as Julian's wife. $250,000 was an enormous sum, especially for people living in poverty in rural Virginia. Schallenberger began planting the idea of murder in Teresa's mind. Later, in a letter to another woman, Schallenberger would describe his strategy with chilling clarity. He wrote that Teresa was just what I was looking for, some ugly bitch who married her husband for the money, and I knew I could get to fall head over heels for me. He told an investigator that from the moment he met Teresa, he knew she was someone who could be easily manipulated. He said he had a plan for how he could use her to get money. Teresa, with her dependent personality disorder and intellectual limitations, was incapable of seeing through Schallenberger's manipulation. When he suggested that there was a way to get the insurance money, she listened. When he told her what needed to happen, she agreed. She was not the architect of the murder plot. She was the tool Schallenberger used to access the victims. The plan was straightforward. On October 30th, 2002, Teresa would go out with friends to establish an alibi. She would leave the door to the mobile home unlocked. She had already provided money for Schallenberger and Fuller to purchase shotguns and ammunition. While she was away, the two men would enter the home and shoot Julian and CJ as they slept. That evening, Teresa went out with friends. She made sure she was seen in public, creating a record of her whereabouts. Meanwhile, shortly after 3:00 a.m., Schallenberger and Fuller entered the mobile home through the unlocked door. They moved quietly through the dark house. CJ was asleep in one room. The gunman shot him multiple times. He died quickly, his body riddled with birdshot. Julian was in the master bedroom. They shot him in the abdomen, firing multiple times. But Julian did not die immediately. He was gravely wounded, in terrible pain, but still alive. Teresa returned to the mobile home after the shooting. She waited approximately 45 minutes before calling 911. During that time, Julian lay dying. When police arrived, he was still conscious, moaning, "Baby, baby, baby," over and over. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, but he died shortly after arrival. Teresa told police that she had come home to find her husband and stepson shot. She claimed she had no idea who could have done such a thing. But investigators quickly grew suspicious. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen except Julian's wallet, which was a clumsy attempt to stage a robbery. Teresa's story did not add up. Within days, investigators connected Teresa to Schallenberger and Fuller. The purchase of the shotguns was traced. Cell phone records showed communications between Teresa and Schallenberger in the hours before and after the murder. When confronted, Schallenberger eventually confessed and provided details of the plot. Fuller confirmed the account. Both men agreed to testify against Teresa in exchange for plea agreements. Before trial, prosecutors offered Teresa the same deal they offered the gunman: life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. Schallenberger and Fuller accepted the deals. Teresa, on the advice of her attorneys and perhaps not fully understanding the implications, chose to plead guilty but refused to accept the plea agreement. She went to trial facing the death penalty. At Teresa's trial in 2002, prosecutors painted her as the mastermind. They argued that she had seduced Schallenberger, convinced him to commit murder, provided the weapons, and arranged the entire plot. They emphasized that she had waited 45 minutes before calling 911, suggesting she wanted to make sure Julian died. The prosecution acknowledged that Teresa had not pulled the trigger, but they characterized her as the head of the conspiracy, the person who had corrupted two men and turned them into killers. The defense presented evidence of Teresa's intellectual disability. Testing after her arrest showed her IQ was 70 on one test and 73 on another. 3 different forensic psychologists testified that Teresa had dependent personality disorder, which made it extremely difficult for her to function independently or resist pressure from others. They explained that someone with Teresa's cognitive limitations and personality disorder would be highly susceptible to manipulation by a more sophisticated person like Schallenberger. but the jury heard only part of the story. They did not know the full extent of Schallenberger's manipulation. The letter in which he described targeting Teresa as some ugly bitch who could be easily used would not be fully examined until years later, during appeals. At trial, Teresa was portrayed as a calculating woman who had used sex and promises of money to convince two men to murder her family. The jury convicted Teresa Lewis of 2 counts of capital murder. They recommended the death penalty. On October 4, 2002, she was formally sentenced to death. She became the only woman on Virginia's death row. Matthew Schallenberger and Rodney Fuller, the men who had actually entered the home and fired the shotguns that killed Julian and C.J. Lewis, received life sentences. They would eventually be eligible for parole. Teresa, who had not touched a gun, would face execution. The disparity in sentencing became the central issue in Teresa's appeals. Her attorneys argued that it violated basic principles of proportionality and fairness to execute someone who had not committed the actual killing while sparing the lives of those who had. They pointed to evidence that Schallenberger had manipulated Teresa from the beginning, that he had identified her as a vulnerable target and used her intellectual limitations and desperate need for affection against her. In 2006, while in prison, Matthew Schallenberger died by suicide. Before his death, he provided statements confirming that he had been the driving force behind the murder plot. He admitted that the only reason he had pursued a relationship with Teresa was to gain access to the insurance money. He said he had manipulated the entire situation and that he knew from the moment he met Teresa that he could use her. But the appeals courts found these revelations insufficient to overturn Teresa's conviction or sentence. They ruled that even if Schallenberger had manipulated Teresa, she had still participated knowingly in the murders. She had provided the means, left the door unlocked, and waited before calling for help. The courts held that her intellectual disability did not rise to the level that would make her execution unconstitutional under Atkins v. Virginia, which prohibited the execution of individuals with intellectual disabilities. Teresa's IQ of 70 placed her just above the threshold that most states use to define intellectual disability. As Teresa's execution date approached in 2010, her case drew international attention. The European Union sent a letter to Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell asking him to commute her sentence to life. The letter cited Teresa's mental capacity and argued that executing people with cognitive disorders violates minimum standards of human rights. Human rights organizations around the world echoed this concern. Mental health experts pointed out that IQ tests have a margin of error of plus or minus 5 points. Teresa's score of 70 could mean her true intellectual functioning was 65, which would place her squarely within the intellectually disabled range. They argued that using a rigid cutoff ignored the reality of how intellectual disability presents and the vulnerabilities it creates. Former corrections officials who had worked with Teresa urged clemency. They testified that she had been a model prisoner, that she had shown genuine remorse, and that her behavior in prison demonstrated she was not a danger. They noted that she had reached out to other inmates at their lowest points and helped them recognize their worth. One former warden said that if Teresa's life were spared, she could continue to provide hope and support to other incarcerated women. Teresa's own statements reflected her limited understanding. She said repeatedly that she was sorry, that she wished she could take it back, and that she would do anything to undo what had happened. Her expressions of remorse had a childlike quality that underscored her intellectual limitations. She seemed unable to fully grasp the legal complexities of her situation, but understood that she had done something terribly wrong. Governor McDonnell declined to grant clemency. The Board of Pardons and Paroles also denied her appeal. On September 23, 2010, Teresa Lewis was prepared for execution. Her last meal consisted of fried chicken breasts, peas with butter, German chocolate cake, apple pie, and a Dr. Pepper. Members of Julian and C.J. Lewis's family were present to witness the execution. They had maintained throughout that Teresa deserved to die for orchestrating the murders. Douglas's daughter, Kathy Clifton, said that while she had forgiven Teresa, the execution would allow her to close this chapter and move forward. She believed that Teresa's death ensured she could never harm anyone again. As the execution began, Teresa appeared frightened when she entered the death chamber. She was strapped to the gurney, and the witnesses took their places. Teresa's final words were a message to Kathy Clifton. "I just want Kathy to know that I love her, and I'm very sorry." The lethal injection was administered at 9:00 p.m. on September 23, 2010. Teresa Lewis was pronounced dead at 9:13 p.m. She was 41 years old. She became the first woman executed in the United States in 5 years, and the first woman executed in Virginia in 98 years. The last woman Virginia had executed was a 17-year-old girl in 1912. Teresa's execution generated immediate controversy. Death penalty opponents and mental health advocates argued that the state had executed someone who lacked the intellectual capacity to be held fully responsible for her actions. They pointed out that the men who had actually committed the murders were alive in prison, while Teresa, the person they had manipulated and used, was dead. The case highlighted fundamental questions about the death penalty and intellectual disability. The Supreme Court in Atkins v. Virginia had recognized that executing people with intellectual disabilities violates the Eighth Amendment because their reduced capacity diminishes their culpability. But states were left to define intellectual disability and set their own thresholds. Teresa's case showed how rigid application of IQ cutoffs could result in executing someone whose cognitive limitations made them vulnerable to manipulation. There was also the question of gender. Would a man with the same IQ and the same level of participation have been characterized as the mastermind? Or would prosecutors have recognized him as the tool used by more sophisticated killers? Critics argued that gendered expectations about women as manipulators and seductresses had influenced how Teresa was portrayed and sentenced. Julian and C.J. Lewis lost their lives because of greed and manipulation. They were shot as they slept, given no chance to defend themselves. Their deaths were tragic and unjust. But executing Teresa Lewis, a woman with borderline intellectual disability who had been targeted and used by men who saw her vulnerabilities as opportunities, did not restore what was taken. It simply added another death to a case already defined by exploitation and injustice. 4 years after Teresa's execution, Rodney Fuller remains in prison, serving his life sentence. He will eventually be eligible for parole. Matthew Schallenberger is dead by his own hand, and Teresa Lewis, the woman both men used to gain access to victims and money, was executed by the state that characterized her as the mastermind, despite overwhelming evidence that she was incapable of masterminding anything. The case stands as a troubling example of how the death penalty can be applied in ways that defy basic principles of proportionality and fairness, and how intellectual disability, when it falls just outside arbitrary legal thresholds, can leave vulnerable people without protection from ultimate punishment. Case 6. Wendy Andriano. He was already dying. The cancer was terminal, and the doctors had given him months at most. But for Wendy Andriano, her husband's death was not coming fast enough. What she did in the early morning hours of October 8, 2000, revealed not just impatience, but a level of calculated cruelty that would shock even experienced investigators. This was not a mercy killing. This was murder driven by greed and resentment, carried out with methodical brutality against a man too weak to defend himself. Wendy Elizabeth Ochoa married Joseph Andriano in January 1994. In the beginning, the marriage seemed promising. Joe was hard-working and devoted to building a life together. But not long after the wedding, Joe began experiencing troubling symptoms. He felt persistently ill, suffered from pain, and struggled to get accurate diagnoses. Doctors misdiagnosed his condition repeatedly over several years. By 1998, after extensive testing, Joe finally received the devastating news. He had adenoid cystic carcinoma, a rare and aggressive form of cancer. By the time it was properly identified, the disease had progressed to the point where it was terminal. Joe tried holistic therapies, desperate to find something that might work. He changed his diet, pursued alternative treatments, and held on to hope. But by 2000, he had accepted that his options were limited and began chemotherapy, knowing it would only buy him time, not save his life. During these years, Wendy gave birth to 2 children. The couple's young son and daughter needed care, and Joe's illness meant he could no longer work. The burden of managing the household and serving as the primary caregiver fell on Wendy. She worked as an apartment manager, a demanding job that required her to handle tenant complaints, maintenance issues, and property management, while also caring for a terminally ill husband and 2 small children. Wendy began to resent the weight of these responsibilities. Rather than finding support through Joe's illness, she grew bitter. She started frequenting bars, drinking heavily, and seeking attention from other men. Witnesses later testified that they saw Wendy at local bars, dancing, flirting, groping, and kissing men. She was having multiple affairs while Joe was at home, too sick to leave the house. The resentment extended beyond just the caregiving burden. There was money at stake. Joe and Wendy were pursuing a medical malpractice lawsuit related to the years of misdiagnoses that had delayed his cancer treatment. If Joe died before the case was settled, Wendy believed she could receive as much as $20 million. But if Joe lingered too long and the case resolved while he was still alive, the settlement structure would be different. Financial considerations began to drive Wendy's thinking. She also attempted to take out life insurance policies on Joe, but insurance companies required medical examinations, and Joe's terminal condition made him uninsurable. Wendy tried to circumvent this by asking men she knew to impersonate Joe during the required physical exams. She offered one man $10,000 to pose as her dying husband. When that failed, she asked another. These attempts to commit insurance fraud demonstrated her willingness to lie and manipulate for financial gain. By the fall of 2000, Wendy had made a decision. Joe was going to die anyway. Why wait? She began planning how to make it happen. On the night of October 7th, 2000, Wendy, Joe, and their 2 young children had a backyard barbecue at their apartment complex in Ahwatukee, a suburban area of Phoenix. It was an ordinary family evening. Later that night, they put the children to bed. Joe, weakened by illness and treatment, likely went to sleep expecting nothing unusual. Around 2:00 a.m. on October 8th, Wendy called a coworker who lived in the same apartment complex. She asked him to come over and watch her children because she needed to take Joe to the doctor. The coworker, though confused by the late hour, agreed to help. When he arrived at the apartment, Wendy told him something disturbing. "I have a problem. Don't ask any questions. My husband's on the floor dying, and I haven't called 911 yet." The coworker was alarmed. He urged Wendy to call for emergency services immediately. She agreed, and paramedics were dispatched to the apartment. But when they arrived and began unloading their equipment, Wendy suddenly came around from the back of the house and told them to leave. She claimed that Joe had a do not resuscitate order and that his wish was to die at home. The paramedics, trained to respect DNR orders, packed up their equipment and left. The coworker also departed. About 1 hour later, Wendy called 911 again. This time she reported that she had stabbed and beaten her husband. When paramedics and police arrived, They entered the apartment and found a scene of horror. Joe Andriano was lying on the floor in a massive pool of blood. Surrounding his body were the broken remains of a bar stool, pieces of a shattered lamp, and a large, bloody knife. Joe had been struck in the head 23 times with such force that the bar stool had broken apart. He also had a large stab wound in his neck from a 13-inch knife that had been plunged deep into his throat. The medical examiner later determined that Joe had sustained at least 4 major stab wounds to the back of his head and neck. But the brutality extended beyond the stabbing and beating. When investigators searched the apartment, they found gelatin capsules filled with sodium azide in a bottle labeled herbal supplements. Sodium azide is a pesticide, extremely toxic to humans. Police searched Wendy's storage unit and found a 500-gram bottle of the substance. Nearly 21 grams were missing from the bottle. Testing on Joe's body revealed sodium azide in his system. Investigators found traces of the poison in a pot of soup and in 2 bowls. The evidence indicated that Wendy had fed Joe soup laced with pesticide, attempting to poison him before resorting to more direct violence. When questioned by police, Wendy initially claimed self-defense. She said that Joe had voluntarily taken the poison in pill form as part of a plan they had developed together to end his suffering on his terms. She claimed he wanted to die and had asked her to help. But when the poison did not work quickly enough, she said Joe became enraged when he learned she had been unfaithful. According to Wendy, Joe attacked her, and she defended herself by hitting him with the bar stool. She said he then stabbed himself in the neck, and she continued striking him in self-defense. Investigators found this story implausible. The physical evidence told a different story. Joe had been struck in the back of the head repeatedly. The wounds were consistent with someone standing over him and beating him as he lay helpless on the floor. The stab wound to his neck had been inflicted with tremendous force, driven deep into his throat. For a man in the advanced stages of terminal cancer, weakened by illness and chemotherapy, the idea that he could have fought back or attacked Wendy made no sense. Prosecutors also noted the timeline. Wendy had called paramedics and then sent them away, claiming Joe had a DNR order. But 1 hour later, she called again to report that she had killed him. The hour-long gap suggested she had used that time to complete the murder after failing to achieve it through poisoning alone. Wendy Andriano was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The case went to trial in 2004, and prosecutor Juan Martinez, who would later gain national attention for prosecuting Jodi Arias, presented the state's case against Wendy. The trial lasted 17 weeks. Martinez methodically laid out the evidence: the sodium azide purchased under a false name, the attempts to fraudulently obtain life insurance, the multiple affairs, the financial motive tied to the malpractice lawsuit, and the brutal nature of the killing itself. He presented testimony from Wendy's co-workers and acquaintances describing her behavior in the months leading up to the murder, the bar hopping, the flirting, the affairs, and her growing resentment about caring for Joe. Martinez argued that Wendy had grown tired of waiting for Joe to die. She wanted the malpractice settlement money, and she wanted her freedom. When the poison did not work fast enough, she resorted to beating and stabbing him. The prosecution characterized the murder as especially cruel and heinous, carried out with depravity and motivated by financial gain. The defense presented Wendy as a battered wife who had been abused by Joe throughout their marriage. Her attorneys, David DeLozier and Dan Patterson, argued that she was meek and desperate for affection, that Joe had been controlling and abusive, and that the killing had occurred during a confrontation in which she feared for her life. They suggested that Joe had indeed been part of a plan to end his own suffering and that the situation had spiraled out of control. Wendy took the witness stand for 9 days, an unusually long time for a defendant to testify. She maintained that she had been abused, that Joe had planned his own death, and that she had acted in self-defense. But under cross-examination by Martinez, inconsistencies in her story emerged. The prosecution presented testimony from friends and family members who said they had never observed any signs of abuse. No one had ever seen bruises, heard Joe threaten Wendy, or witnessed behavior consistent with domestic violence. The jury did not believe Wendy's account. On November 18, 2004, after 2.5 hours of deliberation, they convicted her of first-degree murder. During the penalty phase, the jury found that the murder had been committed in an especially cruel manner, and that financial gain had been the motivating factor. These aggravating circumstances made Wendy eligible for the death penalty. On December 22, 2004, Wendy Andriano was sentenced to death. She became the second woman on Arizona's death row. The trial judge, in pronouncing sentence, stated that Wendy had very clearly intended for her children to die, that she was staging this murder as her final act of revenge. He found no credible evidence of abuse and concluded that Wendy had killed Joe out of impatience and greed. Joe's family was present for the sentencing. His parents and sisters had been raising Wendy and Joe's 2 young children since the arrest. One of Joe's sisters, Ginea Lambeth, said the conviction and sentence brought relief. She expressed hope that the children could now have the normal family life they deserved, away from the woman who had murdered their father. Wendy's appeals have focused on several issues. Her attorneys argued that the trial was unfair because the judge showed bias toward the prosecution and hostility toward the defense. They claimed that the prosecutor's heavy emphasis on Wendy's affairs and her behavior at bars had unfairly prejudiced the jury by attacking her character based on gender stereotypes. They also argued that the jury should have been allowed to consider lesser charges, such as second-degree murder or manslaughter, rather than being forced to choose between first-degree murder and acquittal. The Arizona Supreme Court reviewed these claims and affirmed Wendy's conviction and sentence in July 2007. The court found that while the trial judge had been frustrated with defense counsel and had issued sanctions for procedural violations, there was no evidence of bias that affected the outcome. The court also held that the emphasis on Wendy's affairs was relevant to establishing motive and showing her state of mind. A 2023 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in a case called Cruz v. Arizona potentially affects Wendy's sentence. The ruling held that juries in death penalty cases must be informed that if they sentence a defendant to life imprisonment, that means life without the possibility of parole. Wendy's jury was not given this instruction, which raises the question of whether they would have chosen a different sentence had they known that a life sentence meant Wendy would never be released. As of 2025, Wendy Andriano remains on death row at the Lumley unit of the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville. Her appeals continue. She is now 55 years old. No execution date has been set. Arizona has resumed executions after a hiatus, but Wendy is among the death row inmates whose appeals remain unresolved. The case stands as one of the most disturbing examples of spousal murder driven by financial motive. Joe Andriano was a man facing his own mortality with courage, trying holistic treatments and eventually accepting chemotherapy to extend the time he had left with his children. He was betrayed by the person who had promised to love him in sickness and in health. The method of the murder, poisoning, followed by a sustained and brutal beating, demonstrates a level of cruelty that goes beyond simply wanting someone dead. Wendy had options. She could have divorced Joe. She could have left. But divorce would have meant splitting assets and losing access to the potential malpractice settlement. She chose murder instead, and she chose to inflict it in a way that ensured Joe's final moments were filled with terror and agony. Her defense of abuse was not supported by evidence. No one who knew the couple had seen signs of violence or control. Joe's family and friends described him as a kind man who loved his children and was trying to fight his illness with dignity. The image of Wendy as a battered woman desperately defending herself did not align with the evidence of her bar-hopping, affairs, and attempts to fraudulently obtain insurance money. What remains most disturbing about the case is the calculation behind it. Wendy did not act in a moment of passion or rage. She planned the murder, purchased the poison, attempted to carry it out slowly, and when that failed, resorted to violence that required sustained physical effort. Beating someone 23 times with a bar stool is not a reflexive act. It requires determination and a willingness to continue inflicting violence even as the victim suffers. Joe Andriano's children lost their father twice, once to cancer's slow advance and again to their mother's impatience and greed. They are being raised by Joe's family, growing up with the knowledge of how their father died and who killed him. That knowledge is a burden no child should bear. Wendy Andriano sits on death row, her appeal slowly working through the courts. Whether she will eventually face execution or spend the rest of her life in prison remains uncertain, but what is certain is that her case represents one of the clearest examples of murder motivated not by passion or mental illness or abuse, but by cold, calculated greed and a chilling willingness to inflict suffering on someone too weak to fight back. Case 7. Kimberly McCarthy. She knocked on her elderly neighbor's door and asked to borrow sugar, a request so ordinary that Dorothy Booth never hesitated to let her inside. Minutes later, the retired college professor lay dying on her floor, her fingers severed to steal the wedding ring she had worn for decades. Kimberly McCarthy drove away in the victim's car, pawned the ring for $200, and used the money to buy crack cocaine. When Texas executed her 16 years later, she became the state's 500th execution since 1982, a grim milestone that symbolized both an individual's descent into addiction-fueled violence and a state's aggressive embrace of capital punishment. Kimberly LaGale McCarthy was born in May 1961. For much of her early life, she followed a conventional path. She pursued education and career training, eventually becoming a licensed occupational therapist. She worked in healthcare, helping patients recover function and independence after illness or injury. By outward appearances, she was a professional woman building a stable life. But beneath that stability, Kimberly was struggling with addiction. She began using crack cocaine, a drug that would come to dominate and ultimately destroy her life. Crack addiction is notoriously difficult to overcome. It creates intense cravings and compulsive use patterns that override judgment and reason. As Kimberly's addiction deepened, her life began to unravel. She lost her professional credentials. Her career as an occupational therapist ended as the addiction made it impossible to maintain employment. She turned to theft and fraud to support her habit. In the early 1990s, she was convicted of forgery and sentenced to 2 years in prison. She was released on parole after serving just 4 months, discharged from supervision in December 1991. But the underlying addiction remained untreated, and the cycle continued. By 1997, Kimberly was living in Lancaster, a suburban community in Dallas County. She had felony convictions for theft, forgery, and prostitution on her record. Her life had become a pattern of seeking money for drugs through whatever means necessary. She no longer had access to legitimate income. Crime had become her survival strategy. Dorothy Booth was 71 years old, a retired college professor living quietly in her Lancaster home. She had dedicated her career to education, teaching at the university level, and contributing to her community. In retirement, she enjoyed a peaceful life. Her home was comfortable, and she wore the symbols of a long marriage, including her diamond wedding ring. Dorothy and Kimberly were neighbors, though they did not know each other well. On the morning of July 21, 1997, Kimberly approached Dorothy's home. She knocked on the door and, when Dorothy answered, asked if she could borrow some sugar. It was an innocent-sounding request, the kind of neighborly interaction that happens in communities everywhere. Dorothy, seeing no reason to be suspicious, invited Kimberly inside. Once inside Dorothy's home, Kimberly attacked her. She stabbed Dorothy 5 times with a knife, inflicting wounds to her chest, abdomen, back, face, and neck. She also beat Dorothy repeatedly in the face with a metal candelabrum, striking her with such force that the elderly woman had no chance to defend herself or escape. At some point during the attack, while Dorothy was still alive, Kimberly cut off her left ring finger to remove the diamond wedding ring. The brutality of that act, severing a finger from a dying woman rather than simply pulling off a ring, spoke to the frenzy of the attack and the desperation driving it. Kimberly took Dorothy's purse and left the house. She walked out, covered in blood, and went somewhere to clean herself up. The next morning, dressed for work as if nothing had happened, Kimberly drove Dorothy's car to a crack house to purchase drugs. She then went to a pawn shop and sold Dorothy's wedding ring for $200. She used Dorothy's credit cards at least 4 times throughout the day, making purchases without concern that she would be traced. Dorothy Booth's body was discovered later that day. The scene was horrific. The elderly woman had been stabbed, beaten, and mutilated. The brutality shocked investigators and the Lancaster community. This was not a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was sustained violence inflicted on a vulnerable woman who had done nothing more than open her door to a neighbor. Police quickly began investigating. They discovered that items were missing from Dorothy's home, including her purse and her car. Credit card records showed that Dorothy's cards had been used after her death. Surveillance footage and transaction records helped investigators identify Kimberly McCarthy as a suspect. The pawn shop provided records showing that Kimberly had sold a diamond ring matching the description of Dorothy's wedding ring. When police arrested Kimberly, they found Dorothy's credit cards in her possession. They also found a large knife stained with Dorothy's blood. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Blood from the crime scene matched Dorothy's DNA. The ring at the pawn shop was identified as Dorothy's. The credit card transactions placed Kimberly using the victim's cards within hours of the murder. Kimberly initially denied involvement, but faced with the evidence, she eventually gave a written confession. In her statement, she claimed that 2 drug dealers who were visiting her apartment had asked her, after her money ran out, if she knew anyone they could rob. She said she suggested Dorothy Booth and that the drug dealers told her to call Dorothy and ask to borrow sugar as a pretense. According to her confession, the drug dealers went inside while she waited in Dorothy's car, and they emerged with Dorothy's belongings. Kimberly admitted driving Dorothy's car, selling her possessions for drugs, and using her credit cards. Prosecutors believed this story was fabricated. The defense made no effort at trial to present evidence that anyone else had been involved in the killing. The physical evidence pointed to Kimberly acting alone. The confession appeared to be an attempt to minimize her direct responsibility while admitting to participation in the crime. Kimberly McCarthy was charged with capital murder and went to trial in Dallas County in November 1998. During the trial, prosecutors presented the forensic evidence, the credit card records, the pawn shop transaction, and testimony about Kimberly's crack cocaine addiction. They argued that she had targeted Dorothy because she was elderly, vulnerable, and lived alone. The murder was committed during the course of a robbery to obtain money and items that could be converted to cash for drugs. During the punishment phase of the trial, prosecutors presented additional damaging information. They revealed that Kimberly had been indicted but never tried for 2 other murders of elderly women in Dallas County in December 1988. Maggie Harding, 81 years old, had been stabbed and bludgeoned with a meat tenderizer. Jetty Lucas, 85 years old, had been beaten with a claw hammer and stabbed with a knife. Both women were related to or close friends of Kimberly's family. Though Kimberly was never convicted of these crimes, prosecutors used the evidence to show a pattern of targeting elderly women. The jury convicted Kimberly McCarthy of capital murder on November 24, 1998, and sentenced her to death. However, in December 2001, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned her conviction. The appellate court found that police had taken Kimberly's confession after she had requested a lawyer, violating her constitutional rights. The confession should not have been admitted at trial. Kimberly was granted a new trial. At the second trial in 2002, prosecutors could not use the confession, but they had extensive physical evidence. They presented a butcher knife found in Kimberly's home that had been washed but still contained traces of Dorothy's blood inside the plastic handle. They presented the credit card records, the pawn shop transaction, and testimony about Kimberly's presence at Dorothy's home. On November 1, 2002, a second jury convicted Kimberly McCarthy and again sentenced her to death. This time, the conviction stood. Kimberly's appeals focused on a different issue: racial bias in jury selection. Kimberly was black. Dorothy Booth was white. At Kimberly's second trial, the jury consisted of 11 white jurors and 1 black juror. Dallas County had a well-documented history of racial discrimination in jury selection, particularly by prosecutors in death penalty cases. In 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court had reversed another Dallas County death sentence in a case called Miller L. v. Dretke, finding clear evidence of racist jury selection tactics by prosecutors. The court noted that Dallas County prosecutors had systematically excluded black jurors through peremptory strikes and had asked different questions of white and non-white prospective jurors. Kimberly's attorneys argued that the same discrimination had occurred in her case. Prosecutors had used peremptory strikes to dismiss 75% of the black prospective jurors in the jury pool. Her trial attorneys had failed to object to these strikes at the time, which meant the issue was procedurally defaulted and could not be raised on appeal under normal rules. But Kimberly's appellate attorneys sought to overcome this procedural bar by arguing that the failure to object constituted ineffective assistance of counsel. The courts ultimately rejected these arguments. They found that while Dallas County's history of discrimination was troubling, Kimberly's case did not present sufficient evidence of discriminatory intent in her specific jury selection to warrant overturning the conviction. By 2013, Kimberly McCarthy had exhausted her appeals. The U.S. Supreme Court denied her final petition in January. An execution date was set for January 29, 2013, but she received a stay just hours before the scheduled time to allow her attorneys to pursue the jury discrimination claims. A second execution date was set for April 3, 2013, but that was also stayed. Finally, a third execution date was set for June 26, 2013. This time, no stay was granted. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied Kimberly's appeals on the days leading up to the execution. As June 26 approached, it became clear that Kimberly would be executed, and that her death would mark a significant milestone. She would be the 500th person executed in Texas since the state resumed capital punishment in 1982. Outside the Huntsville prison unit where Texas conducts executions, protesters gathered to oppose the death penalty. They held signs reading, "Don't kill for me," and "End executions in Texas." They chanted, clapped, and sang, drawing attention to what they saw as the moral wrong of state-sanctioned killing. On the other side of the prison, a smaller group of capital punishment supporters stood silently, believing that justice required Kimberly's execution. Inside the prison, Kimberly spent her final day reading, packing her belongings, and meeting with her spiritual advisor, her ex-husband, and a prison chaplain. She was described by prison staff as alternating between subdued reflection and occasional humor. She had requested a last meal of oatmeal, fruit, and chicken sandwiches for breakfast, but her final meal before execution was not recorded. Dorothy Booth's family traveled to Huntsville to witness the execution. Her daughter, Dr. Donna Aldred, and granddaughter, Leslie Aldred Lambert, had waited nearly 16 years for this moment. They believed that Kimberly's execution would bring closure and allow them to finally say goodbye to Dorothy completely. At 6:17 p.m. on June 26, 2013, Kimberly McCarthy was brought into the execution chamber and strapped to the gurney. She looked toward the window where her family and supporters were watching. Her final words reflected the religious faith she had maintained during her years on death row. "Thank you, everybody. This is not a loss. This is a win. You know where I am going. I am going home to be with Jesus. Keep the faith. I love y'all." The lethal injection began. A single dose of pentobarbital was administered. Kimberly McCarthy was pronounced dead at 6:37 p.m., 20 minutes after the injection started. She was 52 years old. She became the first woman executed in the United States in nearly 3 years and the fourth woman executed in Texas since the death penalty was reinstated. After the execution, Dorothy's daughter and granddaughter stood outside the prison. Dr. Aldred released a statement. "My mother, Dorothy Booth, was an incredible woman who was taken before her time. After waiting for nearly 16 years, the finality of today's events have allowed me to completely say goodbye to my mother." Kimberly's attorney, Maury Levin, condemned the execution. She argued that Kimberly's case was plagued by shameful errors, including racial bias in jury selection and ineffective assistance of counsel. She said that as the emblem of Texas's 500th execution, Kimberly's death was something all Texans should be ashamed of. The case highlighted the intersection of addiction, poverty, and violence. Kimberly McCarthy had once been a trained professional with a career helping others. Crack cocaine destroyed that life and turned her into someone capable of horrific violence against a vulnerable elderly woman. The addiction did not excuse what she did, but it provided context for understanding how someone travels from occupational therapist to murderer. The racial dimension of the case also drew attention. Dallas County, which has sent more people to death row than any other county in Texas except Harris County, has a documented history of racial discrimination in jury selection. Whether that discrimination affected Kimberly's specific case remains contested, but the pattern was undeniable. As Texas's 500th execution, Kimberly McCarthy became a symbol. For death penalty supporters, she represented justice for victims and their families, the consequence deserved by someone who had committed brutal murder. For death penalty opponents, she represented a system infected with racial bias, excessive use of capital punishment, and the failure to adequately address addiction as a social and medical issue rather than simply a criminal one. Dorothy Booth lost her life in a senseless act of violence, killed in her own home by someone she had no reason to fear. She deserved better than to die. For a wedding ring worth $200 at a pawn shop. Her family's grief is real and enduring, and no execution can restore what was taken from them. Kimberly McCarthy is gone, executed as the law prescribed. The debate about whether her execution represented justice or simply perpetuated a flawed system continues. What remains undisputed is that addiction, left untreated, can transform people into versions of themselves they never imagined becoming, and that once violence of this magnitude occurs, there are no solutions that can make things right, only decisions about how society responds to the irreversible harm that has been done. Case 8. Sandy Nieves. They were ages 12, 11, 7, and 5, 4 sisters who shared a mother but had never asked to be born into her chaos. On the night of July 1, 1998, Sandy Nieves made her daughters sleep together on the kitchen floor, a deviation from routine that should have alarmed them. Then she poured gasoline throughout the house, set it on fire, and sat down in the living room as her children died from smoke inhalation just feet away. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of lost control. This was calculated revenge, using her own daughters as weapons against the men who had rejected her. Sandy Dawn Neves was born in 1964. Her adult life was characterized by instability, particularly in romantic relationships. She had been married twice and had children with both husbands. Her two oldest daughters, Nicolette Amber Neves and Rachel Holly Neves, were from her first marriage. Her two younger daughters, Crystal Dawn Folden and Jacqueline Marie Folden, were from her second marriage. She also had a son, David, who was 14 years old in 1998. By the late 1990s, Sandy was involved with a third man, though she was not married to him. This relationship, like the others before it, was turbulent. Sandy was emotionally volatile, prone to intense reactions to perceived slights or rejections. Her romantic relationships consumed her, and when they ended or became troubled, her rage was profound. In the spring and summer of 1998, Sandy's relationship with this third partner was deteriorating. He was pulling away, and Sandy could feel the rejection coming. She had been through this before with the fathers of her children, relationships that had begun with hope and ended with bitterness. But this time, something shifted in Sandy. The rage she felt was not directed only at the man who was leaving her. It expanded to encompass all the men who had disappointed her, and she began to view her children not as people she loved, but as extensions of those men, symbols of relationships that had failed. Sandy began to talk about revenge. She made comments to acquaintances, suggesting she wanted to hurt the men in her life, to make them suffer the way she had suffered. But the revenge she was planning would not target the men directly. It would target what they had created with her, their children. On July 1st, 1998, Sandy was alone in the house with her 5 children. The family lived in Saugus, a suburban area of Santa Clarita in northern Los Angeles County. It was a normal summer evening. The children were preparing for bed, but Sandy had made preparations of her own. She had obtained gasoline and stored it in the house. She had planned what she would do and how she would do it. As evening turned to night, she instructed all 4 of her daughters to sleep together on the kitchen floor. This was unusual. The girls normally slept in their bedrooms, but Sandy insisted, and the girls, accustomed to obeying their mother even when her behavior seemed odd, complied. 12-year-old Nicolette, 11-year-old Rachel, 7-year-old Crystal, and 5-year-old Jacqueline spread sleeping bags on the kitchen floor and settled in for the night. They had no way of knowing that their mother had just made them easier to kill by gathering them in one place. David, the 14-year-old son, was in a separate room. Whether by design or chance, Sandy's plan did not include him, or perhaps she simply did not ensure he would be in the path of the fire. Once the girls were asleep, Sandy moved through the house pouring gasoline. She soaked the hallway and the bedrooms. She placed items in the oven and set them to burn. Then she ignited the gasoline. Fire spread rapidly through the home, fueled by the accelerant. Thick, toxic smoke filled the rooms. The 4 girls on the kitchen floor never had a chance. They died from smoke and carbon monoxide inhalation, poisoned by the fumes before the flames ever reached them. Their deaths were not instantaneous, but they likely lost consciousness quickly as the smoke overwhelmed their small lungs. Sandy did not flee. She did not call for help. She sat down in the living room, covered herself in soot, as if she too had been trying to escape, and waited. Firefighters received a call about a house fire in Saugus. When they arrived, they moved quickly to extinguish the blaze. The fire was out by the time they entered the house. Inside, they found a scene that would haunt them. Sandy Neves was sitting in the living room covered in soot. In the kitchen, on sleeping bags spread across the floor, lay 4 young girls. All were dead. David, the teenage son, had survived. He had been in a different part of the house and had managed to escape the worst of the smoke. He was taken outside, treated by paramedics, and questioned by investigators. Firefighters and police immediately suspected arson. The burn patterns were inconsistent with an accidental fire. The presence of gasoline was detected. Items had been deliberately placed in the oven and ignited. Most damning, all four girls had been positioned together on the kitchen floor, making it impossible for them to escape in different directions. Sandy initially claimed she had no idea how the fire had started. She suggested it might have been an accident, that perhaps one of the children had been playing with matches or something had gone wrong in the kitchen. But investigators were not convinced. The physical evidence told a different story. David provided critical testimony. He told investigators that his mother had been acting strangely in the days before the fire. He described her rage at the men in her life and her talk of revenge. He testified that she had instructed the girls to sleep on the kitchen floor, something that had never been required before. His account, combined with the forensic evidence, painted a clear picture. Sandy Nieves had deliberately set the fire to kill her daughters. Sandy was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of arson, and 1 count of attempted murder of David. Prosecutors argued that she had planned the murders as an act of revenge against the fathers of her children and the current boyfriend who was leaving her. She could not directly harm the men, so she destroyed what they had created with her. The trial began in 2000. It lasted 88 days, one of the longest trials in the county's history at that time. Prosecutors presented the forensic evidence showing that gasoline had been used as an accelerant, that the fire had been deliberately set in multiple locations, and that the girls had been positioned together to ensure they could not escape. They presented David's testimony about his mother's behavior and statements in the days before the fire. The prosecution's theory was that Sandy had used her daughters as instruments of revenge. The trial judge, in comments made during the proceedings, stated that Sandy had very clearly intended for her children to die, that she was staging this multiple murder as her final act of revenge against the men in her life. The judge's characterization would later become central to the appeals. Sandy's defense attorneys argued that she was mentally ill, that she had not intended to kill her children, and that the fire had gotten out of control in a way she had not anticipated. They presented some evidence of mental health issues and suggested that Sandy's behavior was the result of psychological breakdown rather than calculated murder. The jury did not accept the defense's argument. On November 18, 2000, they convicted Sandy Nieves on all counts. During the penalty phase, the jury found special circumstances, multiple murders, lying in wait, and murder committed during the commission of arson. These aggravating factors made Sandy eligible for the death penalty. On October 6, 2000, Sandy Nieves was sentenced to death. She joined the small number of women on California's death row, housed at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. But the case was far from over. Sandy's appellate attorneys identified significant problems with the trial, particularly with the conduct of the trial judge. They argued that the judge had shown bias throughout the proceedings, had aligned himself with the prosecution, had denigrated the defense and defense counsel, and had made inappropriate comments that prejudiced the jury against Sandy. The California Supreme Court reviewed these claims in an appeal that took years to resolve. In May 2021, the court issued its decision. In a unanimous ruling, the justices upheld Sandy's convictions for the 4 murders, the arson, and the attempted murder of David. The court found that the evidence of guilt was overwhelming and that no misconduct by the judge could have altered the jury's determination that Sandy had killed her daughters. However, the court reversed Sandy's death sentence. The justices found that the trial judge's conduct during the penalty phase had been so problematic that it created prejudicial error. The judge had lost control of himself and the courtroom, had made comments that appeared to favor the prosecution, and had humiliated Sandy in front of the jury in ways that went beyond appropriate judicial management. The court explained that even in the most heinous cases, defendants are entitled to a fair trial and an impartial judge. The judge's misconduct, while not affecting the determination of guilt, had tainted the penalty phase. The court could not be confident that the jury would have chosen death over life without parole if the proceedings had been conducted properly. As a result, Sandy's convictions stand, but she will face a new penalty trial to determine whether she should be sentenced to death or to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of 2025, that new trial has not yet occurred. Sandy remains at the Central California Women's Facility, no longer technically on death row, but facing the possibility of a death sentence if a new jury reaches that conclusion. The case raises profound questions about what drives a parent to kill their own children. Familicide, the murder of one's family members, is among the most difficult crimes to comprehend. In some cases, parents kill their children as part of a murder-suicide driven by depression or a delusional belief that they are protecting their children from suffering. In other cases, parents kill children during a psychotic break, believing they are acting on commands from God or responding to hallucinations. But Sandy Neves does not fit neatly into those categories. She was not suicidal. She did not kill herself after killing her daughters. She was not in the midst of a psychotic break that made her unable to distinguish reality. According to the trial evidence, she was angry at men and wanted revenge. She chose to enact that revenge by killing the children those men had fathered with her. This represents a particular kind of cruelty, using children as proxies for adult rage. Nicolette, Rachel, Crystal, and Jacqueline had no responsibility for their mother's failed relationships. They had not rejected Sandy or wronged her. They were simply children trying to navigate a chaotic home life with a volatile mother. By all accounts, they loved her and tried to please her, sleeping on the kitchen floor when she told them to, because children obey their parents even when instructions seem strange. David survived, and his survival allowed him to provide testimony that helped convict his mother. But survival in such circumstances is its own form of trauma. He lost all 4 of his siblings in one night, murdered by his own mother. He will carry that for the rest of his life, along with whatever guilt survivors feel when they emerge from tragedy while others do not. The fathers of the children, Sandy's first and second husbands, and the boyfriend who had been pulling away, lost their daughters without having done anything to deserve such loss. Whatever failures existed in their relationships with Sandy, whatever mistakes they made as partners or co-parents, nothing justified what she did. The punishment far exceeded any offense, and it was inflicted not on them directly, but on the innocent children who bore their DNA. The trial judge's statement that Sandy staged the murders as a final act of revenge against the men in her life was likely accurate, but it also reveals the fundamental narcissism of what she did. In Sandy's mind, her daughters were not people with their own lives, hopes, and futures. They were extensions of men she hated, tools she could use to hurt those men, and ultimately expendable in service of her rage. The California Supreme Court's decision to uphold the convictions but reverse the death sentence highlights an important principle. Even defendants accused of the most horrific crimes are entitled to fair proceedings. The court found that the trial judge's conduct was so improper that it tainted the penalty phase, even though it did not affect the jury's finding of guilt. This principle applies even in cases where the crime is nearly impossible to defend and public sympathy for the defendant is non-existent. Whether a new jury will sentence Sandy to death or to life without parole remains to be seen. California has not executed anyone since 2006, and Governor Gavin Newsom has imposed a moratorium on executions. Even if Sandy receives a death sentence at a new penalty trial, she is unlikely to ever be executed under current policies. But the question of punishment, while important, is almost secondary to the question of how such a crime happens in the first place. What must occur in a person's mind for them to gather their children together, douse their home with gasoline, and light it on fire? What level of rage, dysfunction, and moral collapse transforms a mother into a murderer of her own children? There are no satisfying answers. Mental illness, personality disorders, and emotional dysregulation may provide partial explanations, but they do not fully account for the calculated nature of what Sandy did. She planned the fire. She positioned her daughters to maximize the chance they would die. She sat in the living room and waited while they suffocated. Nicolette Amber Neves was 12 years old. Rachel Holly Neves was 11. Crystal Dawn Folden was 7. Jacqueline Marie Folden was 5. They had their whole lives ahead of them. They deserved to grow up, to go to school, to make friends, to experience joy and disappointment, and all the ordinary moments that make up a human life. Instead, they died terrified and confused on a kitchen floor, murdered by the person who should have protected them above all others. Sandy Neves robbed them of their futures to satisfy her rage at men who had disappointed her. That choice, to sacrifice her children as weapons in her adult disputes, marks her crime as one of the most disturbing betrayals of parental duty imaginable. Whatever sentence she ultimately receives, it cannot restore what was taken or make sense of the senseless. It can only represent society's attempt to respond to an act that defies comprehension. Case 9. Melissa Lucio. She was 48 hours away from execution when a judge issued a stay. For 15 years, Melissa Lucio had been on death row for murdering her 2-year-old daughter. But as the execution date approached, new evidence emerged that cast serious doubt on whether a murder had occurred at all. What prosecutors called child abuse, medical experts now say, could have been an accidental fall. What police called a confession, psychologists now recognize as a textbook example of coerced false admission. Unlike the other cases examined here, this may not be a story about guilt at all. It may be a story about how poverty, trauma, and a flawed justice system can combine to send an innocent person to death row. Melissa Lucio was born in 1969 in Lubbock, Texas. Her childhood was marked by abuse. She was sexually abused as a child, trauma that would shape her psychological responses for the rest of her life. As an adult, she became trapped in a cycle of domestic violence, enduring years of physical and emotional abuse from partners. This history of victimization left her with profound vulnerabilities, particularly when confronted by authority figures. By 2007, Melissa was living in Harlingen, a city in the Rio Grande Valley near the Mexican border. She was the mother of 14 children, ranging in age from infancy to teenagers. The family lived in extreme poverty in an overcrowded apartment. Melissa and her partner struggled to provide for the large household. Money was always scarce, space was limited, and the daily challenges of feeding and caring for so many children were overwhelming. Among Melissa's children was 2-year-old Mariah Alvarez, a toddler with a sweet disposition and a developing personality. Like most 2-year-olds, Mariah was active, curious, and still learning to navigate her physical environment. She was prone to the bumps and bruises that come with early childhood, the inevitable result of a small child still mastering balance and coordination. On February 15, 2007, Mariah's short life came to a tragic end. But exactly how she died and whether anyone was responsible remains the central question. 2 days before her death, Mariah had fallen down a steep set of outdoor stairs. The family lived on an upper floor, and the concrete stairs leading to their apartment were steep and dangerous. Mariah tumbled down them, striking the concrete multiple times. The fall was witnessed by family members. Melissa checked on Mariah, who seemed shaken but not critically injured. In a household with 14 children and limited resources, minor injuries were common, and a trip to the hospital for every fall was not financially feasible. Over the next 2 days, Mariah seemed mostly normal, though perhaps more tired than usual. She played, ate, and interacted with her siblings. But on the night of February 17, 2007, Mariah stopped breathing. Melissa and her family immediately called for help and attempted CPR. Paramedics arrived and rushed Mariah to the hospital, but efforts to revive her failed. Mariah was pronounced dead. An autopsy revealed that Mariah had extensive bruising and injuries, including bruising on her back, abdomen, and head. The medical examiner concluded that the injuries were consistent with child abuse, not with an accidental fall. The examiner's opinion was that Mariah had been beaten to death. Police began investigating Melissa Lucio as a suspect. They brought her in for questioning just hours after Mariah's death, while Melissa was still in shock and grief. The interrogation lasted for hours. Melissa was sleep-deprived, emotionally devastated, and psychologically vulnerable due to her history of abuse. The interrogation techniques used by police were aggressive. Interrogators repeatedly told Melissa that they knew she had hurt Mariah, that the evidence proved it, and that she needed to admit what she had done. They minimized the severity of what they were accusing her of, suggesting that it might have been an accident or that she had not meant to hurt Mariah. They told her that taking responsibility was the only way to show she loved her daughter. These are classic techniques from what is known as the Reid technique of interrogation, a method designed to elicit confessions. But research has shown that these techniques are particularly effective at producing false confessions from vulnerable individuals, including people with trauma histories, intellectual disabilities, mental illness, or those who are exhausted and emotionally overwhelmed. After hours of this interrogation, Melissa made statements that police interpreted as a confession. She said, "I guess I did it," and made other equivocal statements suggesting she might have been responsible, but at no point did she provide a coherent account of abusing Mariah. She did not describe hitting, striking, or deliberately harming her daughter. Her statements were vague, uncertain, and made in response to relentless suggestions from interrogators. Melissa was arrested and charged with capital murder. The case against her rested on two main pillars: the medical examiner's determination that Mariah's injuries were caused by abuse, and Melissa's supposed confession. At trial in 2008, prosecutors painted Melissa as an abusive mother who had beaten her daughter to death. They presented the medical examiner's testimony about the injuries. They played portions of the interrogation video, focusing on the moments where Melissa appeared to admit responsibility. They argued that Melissa had a history of losing her temper with her children and that she had killed Mariah in a fit of rage. The defense argued that Mariah's death was accidental, that she had fallen down the stairs 2 days before her death, and that the fall had caused internal injuries that led to her death. They presented testimony from some family members about the fall, but the defense was hampered by limited resources and inadequate investigation. Melissa's court-appointed attorneys did not retain biomechanical experts who could have explained how a fall downstairs could cause the injuries Mariah sustained. They did not present experts on false confessions who could have explained why Melissa's statements were not reliable. They did not adequately challenge the medical examiner's conclusions. The jury convicted Melissa Lucio of capital murder on July 10, 2008. During the penalty phase, the jury sentenced her to death. Melissa became one of the few women on Texas's death row sent to the Mountain View unit in Gatesville. For years, Melissa maintained her innocence. She insisted that she had not hurt Mariah, that her daughter had died from the fall down the stairs, and that police had coerced her into making statements she did not mean. But her appeals were unsuccessful. Courts reviewing her case found that the evidence supported the conviction and that the jury's verdict should stand. Then, as Melissa's execution date approached in 2022, new attention focused on her case. A documentary film, The State of Texas versus Melissa, examined the evidence and raised serious questions about her guilt. Journalists and advocacy organizations began investigating. What they discovered was deeply troubling. Multiple medical experts reviewed Mariah's autopsy and injury patterns. Several concluded that the injuries were entirely consistent with a fall down concrete stairs and inconsistent with the pattern typically seen in child abuse cases. Biomechanical experts explained that when a small child tumbles down a steep staircase, striking concrete multiple times, the resulting injuries can be extensive and can appear similar to abuse. The key difference is the distribution of injuries, and in Mariah's case, the distribution was more consistent with a fall than with beating. Experts in false confessions reviewed the interrogation video. They identified multiple coercive tactics, including minimization, maximization, feeding Melissa information about the supposed crime, and exploiting her vulnerability. They noted that Melissa never provided any details about abusing Mariah because she had no such details to provide. Her statements were responses to suggestions planted by interrogators, not accounts of actual events. Crucially, 5 of the 12 jurors who had convicted Melissa came forward to say that if they had heard this new evidence, they would not have voted to convict her. They said they had been misled by the medical testimony and had not understood that false confessions were possible. They believed new evidence warranted a new trial. Support for Melissa grew across the political spectrum. Conservative and liberal lawmakers in Texas joined together to call for clemency or a new trial. The Innocence Project took up her case. Religious leaders, including prominent evangelicals, urged mercy. More than 80 Texas legislators, both Republicans and Democrats, signed letters supporting Melissa. Even the lead detective in the case later expressed doubts about her guilt. On April 25, 2022, Melissa's execution was scheduled for April 27th. Her legal team filed emergency appeals. National attention focused on Texas. On April 25th, just 2 days before the execution, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued a stay. The court ordered the trial court to review new evidence and consider whether Melissa's conviction and sentence should stand. The stay meant Melissa would not be executed, at least not immediately. But it did not mean she was free or exonerated. She remained on death row while her case was reviewed. Since then, additional evidence has emerged. Medical experts have provided affidavits explaining in detail why Mariah's injuries are consistent with a fall and not abuse. Forensic pathologists have criticized the original medical examiner's conclusions as outdated and not supported by current science. The concept of diagnosing abuse based solely on injury patterns without considering alternative explanations like accidental falls has been increasingly questioned in the medical community. In 2023, the trial court held hearings on Melissa's case. Her attorneys presented the new medical evidence, the false confession evidence, and testimony from the jurors who now believed she should not have been convicted. The prosecution defended the original conviction, arguing that the evidence still supported a finding of guilt and that the new evidence did not prove innocence. As of 2024, Melissa's case remains in legal limbo. The trial court has not yet issued a final ruling. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals will ultimately decide whether Melissa receives a new trial, whether her conviction is overturned, or whether her death sentence stands. The case highlights multiple systemic flaws in the criminal justice system. First, it demonstrates how poverty creates vulnerabilities. Melissa could not afford expert witnesses at trial. She could not hire private attorneys with resources to conduct thorough investigations. She was represented by court-appointed lawyers who were overworked and underfunded. Second, it illustrates how trauma affects interactions with police. Melissa's history of domestic violence and sexual abuse made her psychologically vulnerable to coercive interrogation. Victims of abuse often respond to authority figures with compliance and submission, traits that interrogators can exploit to obtain confessions. Third, it shows the danger of relying on confessions obtained through psychologically manipulative interrogation techniques. Research in false confessions has grown substantially in recent decades, revealing that innocent people can and do confess to crimes they did not commit, particularly when subjected to prolonged, aggressive questioning that suggests confession is the only acceptable outcome. Fourth, it demonstrates how forensic science can be misapplied. The medical examiner's conclusion that Mariah's injuries proved abuse was presented as scientific certainty, but medical diagnosis of abuse is complex and requires considering all possible explanations, not just assuming the most sinister one. Advances in understanding pediatric injuries have shown that many injury patterns once thought to be diagnostic of abuse can also result from accidents. Melissa Lucio has now spent more than 17 years on death row for a crime that may never have occurred. Mariah's death was undoubtedly tragic. A 2-year-old child died, and that loss is devastating. But the question is whether the death was a murder or an accident. If Mariah died from injuries sustained in a fall, then Melissa is not guilty of murder. She is a grieving mother who lost her daughter and was then wrongly convicted of killing her. The bipartisan support for Melissa's case is notable. In an era of deep political polarization, her case has united people across ideological lines. Conservatives concerned about government overreach and the possibility of executing an innocent person have joined with liberals focused on criminal justice reform and the vulnerabilities of domestic violence victims. This unusual coalition suggests that the evidence of Melissa's innocence is compelling enough to overcome partisan divides. Mariah's biological father and some of Melissa's other children believe in her innocence and have advocated for her release. They maintain that Melissa was a loving mother who would never have harmed Mariah, that the fall down the stairs caused Mariah's death, and that Melissa was manipulated into making statements she did not mean. But the legal process moves slowly. Even with substantial new evidence and widespread support, overturning a conviction is difficult. Courts are reluctant to second-guess jury verdicts, and the standard for granting a new trial based on new evidence is high. Melissa remains in a state of uncertainty, not knowing whether she will ultimately be exonerated, retried, or executed. The case forces consideration of a disturbing question: how many people currently on death row might be innocent? If Melissa Lucio came within 2 days of execution despite substantial evidence suggesting she did not commit a crime, how many others are in similar situations? The death penalty is irreversible. Once an execution is carried out, no amount of new evidence can restore life. Melissa's case has become a symbol for death penalty opponents and criminal justice reformers. It illustrates how the system can fail at multiple levels: police interrogation, forensic analysis, trial defense, and appellate review, creating a perfect storm that sends an innocent person to death row. Whether Melissa Lucio will ultimately be exonerated remains unknown. Her case continues through the courts, each hearing and ruling determining whether she will spend the rest of her life in prison, receive a new trial, or face execution. What is known is that her case has already changed conversations about false confessions, forensic science, and the death penalty. Mariah Alvarez died at 2 years old. She deserved better. Better housing, safer stairs, and perhaps medical attention after her fall that might have saved her life. But if the mounting evidence is correct, she did not die because her mother murdered her. She died in a tragic accident, and her mother became a second victim when a flawed investigation and coerced confession sent her to death row. For now, Melissa Lucio waits. She waits for courts to review evidence. She waits for decisions about her fate. and she waits with the hope that justice, though delayed, might finally recognize that she is not a murderer. She is a mother who lost her child and has been punished for a crime that may never have happened. Case 10. Brenda Andrew. The prosecutor opened a suitcase in front of the jury and pulled out clothing item by item, tight shirts, short skirts, revealing dresses. Witnesses were called to testify that the defendant was a hoochie and a slut puppy. The jury heard extensive testimony about her sexual history, her clothing choices, and whether a good mother would dress or behave the way she did. This was not a morality trial in a conservative community decades ago. This was a capital murder trial in Oklahoma in 2004, and the defendant's sexuality became as central to the prosecution's case as the evidence that she had conspired to kill her husband. Brenda Andrew was born in 1963. She grew up in Oklahoma, married young, and built what appeared to be a conventional life. She and her husband, Robert Andrew, had 2 children together. Brenda worked as an insurance agent, a career that required building client relationships and projecting confidence and success. By her late 30s, she seemed to embody suburban middle-class stability. But behind that facade, Brenda's marriage to Robert was deteriorating. The couple had grown apart over the years, their relationship marked by tension and dissatisfaction. By 2001, both Brenda and Robert knew the marriage was ending. They were moving toward separation and eventual divorce. That year, Brenda met James Pavat, a colleague in the insurance industry. Pavat was younger than Brenda, and the two began an affair. The relationship quickly became intense. They spent time together both professionally and personally, and their connection deepened beyond simple attraction. They began making plans for a future together, plans that required Robert Andrew to be out of the picture. Robert had substantial life insurance policies totaling approximately $800,000. If he died, Brenda would be the beneficiary. For Brenda and Pavat, the insurance money represented both financial security and the means to start their new life together without the complications of divorce proceedings that would divide assets. Brenda and Pavat began planning Robert's murder. They discussed how to make it look like a random crime, perhaps a home invasion or robbery gone wrong. They purchased a gun. They coordinated their stories and established alibis. What they were planning was not a crime of passion, but a calculated, premeditated murder motivated by money and convenience. On the evening of November 20th, 2001, the plan was put into motion. Robert Andrew returned to the family home in Oklahoma City. Brenda and Pavat were waiting. They had staged the scene to look like a break-in, planting evidence that would suggest an intruder. When Robert entered the garage, they confronted him. Both Brenda and Pavat shot Robert multiple times. The attack was brutal and sustained. Robert was struck by multiple bullets and collapsed in the garage. He died from his wounds. After the shooting, Brenda and Pavat attempted to clean up and solidify the appearance of a home invasion. They made sure their stories aligned and that physical evidence would support the narrative of an unknown intruder. But investigators were suspicious from the beginning. The crime scene did not look like a typical robbery or random attack. Nothing of significant value had been taken. The staging appeared clumsy and inconsistent. Most importantly, Brenda's account of events did not align with the physical evidence. She claimed she had been elsewhere when the shooting occurred, but forensic analysis suggested otherwise. Police began investigating Brenda and discovered her relationship with James Pavat. They found financial records showing discussions about insurance policies. They traced the purchase of the murder weapon. As evidence accumulated, it became clear that this was not a random crime, but a conspiracy between wife and lover to murder the husband for financial gain. Both Brenda Andrew and James Pavat were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. They were tried separately. Pavat was convicted and sentenced to death in his trial. Then it was Brenda's turn. Brenda's trial began in 2004. The prosecution had strong evidence of her guilt: the affair with Pavat, the financial motive, the purchase of the weapon, forensic evidence placing her at the scene, and the staged nature of the crime scene. This evidence alone could have convicted her. But prosecutor Sandra Elliott chose to make Brenda's sexuality and appearance a central focus of the state's case. Elliott called witnesses to testify about Brenda's clothing choices. They described how she dressed provocatively, wearing tight-fitting clothes and short skirts. Witnesses testified that Brenda had behaved in sexually inappropriate ways, that she had flirted with men, and that she had carried on affairs. One witness called her a hoochie. Another used the phrase slut puppy. These degrading sexual names were entered into the court record and heard by the jury. The prosecutor brought a suitcase into the courtroom filled with Brenda's clothing, items seized from her home during the investigation. Elliott opened the suitcase in front of the jury and held up various garments, inviting the jury to judge Brenda based on her wardrobe. The implication was clear: a woman who dressed this way, who had affairs, who did not conform to traditional standards of modest feminine behavior, was capable of murder. Elliott also questioned witnesses about whether a good mother would dress the way Brenda dressed or behave the way she behaved. The prosecution's argument was not just that Brenda had committed murder, but that her failure to conform to gender expectations made her the kind of woman who would commit murder. This strategy was highly unusual. Male defendants in capital murder trials are rarely, if ever, subjected to extensive cross-examination about their clothing choices or sexual histories unless directly relevant to the crime itself. Male defendants who have affairs are not typically called derogatory sexual names in open court. Their wardrobes are not displayed for juries to judge. But Brenda Andrews' sexuality and appearance became evidence of her moral depravity, which the prosecution used to argue she deserved the death penalty. The defense objected to this line of attack, arguing that Brenda's clothing and sexual history were irrelevant to whether she had murdered her husband. The trial judge allowed much of the testimony to proceed, finding that it was relevant to establishing Brenda's character and motive. The jury heard all of this alongside the actual evidence of the crime. They saw the forensic evidence, heard testimony about the staged crime scene, learned about the affair with Pavat and the insurance motive, but they also heard hours of testimony portraying Brenda as a sexually immoral woman who violated traditional expectations of how wives and mothers should behave. On September 10, 2004, the jury convicted Brenda Andrews of first-degree murder. During the penalty phase, the prosecution continued to emphasize Brenda's sexuality and moral failings. The jury recommended death, and on December 13, 2004, Brenda was formally sentenced to death. She became the only woman on Oklahoma's death row. Brenda's appeals have focused significantly on the gender bias in her prosecution. Her attorneys argue that the emphasis on her sexuality, clothing, and sexual history violated her right to a fair trial. They point out that this kind of character attack based on gender stereotypes is not applied to male defendants and that it prejudiced the jury against her in ways unrelated to her actual guilt. Death penalty experts and legal scholars have cited Brenda's case as a troubling example of how gender stereotypes influence capital prosecutions. Studies have shown that women who violate traditional gender norms by being sexually active, dressing provocatively, showing insufficient emotion, or failing to perform femininity in expected ways are more likely to receive death sentences than women who conform to stereotypes of passive, modest, maternal femininity. The question is not whether Brenda Andrews committed murder. The evidence strongly suggests she did. She conspired with her lover to kill her husband for insurance money. She participated in the shooting. She attempted to cover up the crime. Those facts support her conviction. The question is whether the focus on her sexuality and appearance affected the jury's decision to sentence her to death rather than to life in prison. Would a jury have been as likely to impose death if the prosecution had focused solely on the crime rather than spending extensive time attacking her character based on gendered moral judgments? Consider the facts of the case stripped of the sexual moralizing. A woman and her lover murdered her husband for insurance money. They staged the scene to look like a home invasion. They both shot the victim. This is a serious crime deserving of severe punishment. But is it more deserving of death than similar cases involving men who kill their spouses for insurance money? Statistics show that men who kill their female partners, even in premeditated plots for financial gain, are less likely to receive death sentences than women who kill their male partners. Part of this disparity may stem from how defendants are portrayed. Male defendants are rarely subjected to character attacks based on their sexuality or appearance. Their clothing is not held up for moral judgment. Their affairs, while noted, are not treated as evidence of fundamental moral corruption. The use of terms like hoochie and slut puppy in a court of law is particularly egregious. These are not neutral descriptive terms. They are sexually degrading slurs designed to demean and dehumanize. Their use in legal proceedings signals to jurors that the defendant is not worthy of respect or empathy, making it easier to impose the ultimate punishment. Brenda's attorneys also challenged the jury instructions and other aspects of the trial. They argued that the judge erred in allowing so much prejudicial testimony about matters unrelated to the murder itself. But appeals courts have consistently upheld Brenda's conviction and sentence, finding that even if some testimony was inappropriate, the evidence of guilt was overwhelming and the jury's decision was not affected. As of 2025, Brenda Andrew remains on death row in Oklahoma. She is now 62 years old and has been incarcerated for more than 2 decades. Oklahoma resumed executions in 2021 after a hiatus, and Brenda could eventually face execution if her appeals are exhausted and an execution date is set. James Pavat, her co-defendant who actually participated in shooting Robert Andrew, also remains on death row. The fact that both received death sentences suggests some level of proportionality between their culpability, but the manner in which they were prosecuted differed significantly. Pavat was not subjected to extensive testimony about his appearance or sexual morality. His trial focused on his actions, not his character as measured against gendered expectations. The case raises fundamental questions about equality in the justice system. If 2 people commit the same crime, should they be judged by the same standards? Or is it acceptable for juries to consider whether defendants conform to gender norms when deciding who deserves death? Some argue that Brenda's behavior was relevant because it demonstrated a disregard for marital vows and moral obligations, which speaks to her character. But this argument is troubling because it suggests that sexual morality should be a factor in determining punishment for murder. It also reveals a double standard. Male defendants who have affairs are not typically portrayed as fundamentally immoral because of those affairs. The broader impact of Brenda's case is that it set a precedent for using sexuality and appearance as aggravating factors in capital cases involving women. Prosecutors in other cases have pointed to Brenda's trial as a model, suggesting that emphasizing a female defendant's sexual behavior is an effective strategy for obtaining death sentences. This creates a chilling effect. It means that women accused of serious crimes face not just the criminal charges, but also a trial of their character as measured against patriarchal standards of proper feminine behavior. A woman who dresses attractively, has affairs, or expresses sexuality can find those choices used against her as evidence that she deserves death. Robert Andrew lost his life in a murder motivated by greed and selfish desire. He was shot in his own garage by his wife and her lover, betrayed by the person who had promised to love him. His children lost their father to violence. Those facts are tragic and undeniable, and they deserve acknowledgement and justice. But justice should not be tainted by gender bias. Brenda Andrew should have been prosecuted for what she did, not for how she dressed or who she slept with. The jury should have decided whether she deserved death based on the crime itself, not on whether she conformed to expectations of how a wife and mother should behave. The use of sexual morality as a factor in capital sentencing reveals uncomfortable truths about how gender continues to shape the application of the death penalty. Women are far less likely than men to be sentenced to death, but when they are, gender stereotypes often play a role. Women who are seen as bad mothers, sexually immoral, or unfeminine are more likely to face execution than women who conform to traditional ideals. Brenda Andrew remains on death row, her case a stark illustration of how sexuality can be weaponized in capital prosecutions. Whether she will ultimately be executed or spend the rest of her life in prison remains uncertain. What is certain is that her trial highlighted a troubling reality. In American courtrooms, women accused of murder can find themselves judged not just for their actions, but for their failure to perform femininity in ways that conform to conservative gender norms. And that raises a question that extends far beyond one case. In a justice system that claims to be blind to gender, how do we reconcile the fact that gender stereotypes continue to influence who lives and who dies? These 10 women reached death row through vastly different paths, some through calculated brutality, others through manipulation or addiction, and at least one possibly through wrongful conviction entirely. What unites these cases is not evil, but rather the complex intersection of trauma, mental illness, poverty, and systemic failures that create pathways to unthinkable acts. Their stories force uncomfortable questions. Does the death penalty account adequately for intellectual disability, severe mental illness, and lifetime victimization? Are women judged more harshly when they violate gender expectations? Can any justice system be trusted to make irreversible decisions when new evidence continues emerging decades later? These cases remind us that behind death row statistics are individual tragedies, not just of victims whose lives were stolen, but also of broken systems that fail to protect, treat, and rehabilitate before violence occurs. Which of these cases shocked you most? And do you believe the death penalty was applied fairly in each? What responsibility does society bear when trauma, mental illness, and poverty create pathways to violence? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more in-depth true crime coverage that examines not just the crimes, but the complex human stories and systemic issues behind them.